In May 1996, two young women disappeared into the quiet depths of Virginia's Shenandoah Forest and were later found dead at their secluded campsite, bound and silenced far from any trailhead. What should have been a peaceful hiking trip became a grim mystery whispered among the trees. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Now enjoy the stories. More than 3 decades ago, back when I was a much younger man, I helped a mate of mine move down to Glasgow from our home city of Newcastle. He'd managed to get a job as a football scout for Glasgow Rangers, which was basically his dream career. And so while me and all of our mates were sad to see the back of him, we were all really proud of him too. Now, we drove up early in the morning, and then once everything was unloaded, we had some pub grub and a few lagers, shandies for me, and then I started on the drive back to Newcastle. I'd left it quite late to drive back, so it was about midnight by the time I started to see signs for the English borders. The roads were quiet, with only the occasional lorry thundering past me, and I remember there being some phone-in thing on the radio, but I wasn't really listening. I was in my old Vauxhall Cavalier, an '82 model that I bought on the cheap about 4 years prior. It normally served me well, and it had been running fine all day, but just after passing a place called Jedburgh, the temperature warning light flicked on. I looked at my dash, watching the needle climbing into the red, and swore under my breath as I eased off the accelerator. Since it normally bought me a few minutes, I cranked the heater up full blast to try and pull some heat out of the engine. But that time, it seems my luck finally ran out, because just a minute or so later, there was this loud hiss from under the bonnet before steam started pouring out the seams. Seconds later, I heard this horrible metallic knocking sound coming from under the bonnet, and so I coasted over to the hard shoulder and then came to a stop just in time for the engine to seize up completely. And after that, aside from the ticking of my hazard lights and the sound of hot metal cooling down, there was nothing but silence for a few seconds, until I erupted. I remember shouting, "Are you effing kidding me?" a couple of times, and then, after taking a few deep breaths, I got out of the car and tried to fix it. And I tried it for half an hour, and in that time, a grand total of 2 cars passed me, but even with me waving at them as they passed, neither of them stopped. I didn't just stand there like some plonker for the whole 30 minutes, mind you. I popped my bonnet not long after getting out, but when I did, a load of steam and the smell of burnt coolant came wafting up into my face. And after waving away some of the steam, I spotted a crack in the top radiator hose and then noticed how loads of antifreeze was dripping onto the road and forming a big green puddle. I didn't have a spare hose, and neither did I have enough water to top it up properly, and even if I had, the engine had overheated so badly that I didn't trust it not to seize up again. Basically, I wasn't going anywhere in my old Vauxhall, and since there were no mobile phones back then, at least none for the likes of me, I had no choice but to walk if I wanted to get myself some help. Now, I reckon the nearest emergency phone would have been about a mile down the road, maybe more, and so I locked my car, left my hazards flashing, and then started walking along the dark grass verge with a torch in my hand. Now, I thought I'd be on the move for quite a while, but then no sooner had I started walking, I came to a dirt track, previously concealed by a long hedgerow, which led to what looked like a big 3-story farmer's house. Now, I was so happy that I was literally punching the air, because despite the fact that there were no lights switched on the ground floor, there was what looked to be candlelight in both the front-facing upstairs rooms. I felt bad for calling so late, but since the alternative of walking along the motorway was a much more dangerous one, I reckoned that I didn't have much choice. It was a particularly dark night, small moon and cloud cover, so it was only once I got closer to the house that I saw how run down it was. The ground floor windows were either cracked or newspapered over, and there were cracks in the wood too, along with a lot of peeling paint. And as you can imagine, I started to get really bad vibes from the place. But I try not to judge books by their cover too much, because you tend to be rewarded more times than you're burned for it. And so with that in mind, and granted very foolishly, I decided to knock on the door. I didn't knock too loud or aggressively. I didn't want to frighten anyone. But when my first knock got no answer, I knocked a little bit louder. Again, there was complete silence. No footsteps behind the door, no talking inside, nothing. But then after taking a step back and looking up at the top windows, I saw someone peeking out at me from behind a dirty-looking curtain. And I can't lie, it did scare me a bit seeing a pair of eyes staring back at me through the dim light. But as soon as I reacted, the eyes disappeared and I began to hear voices inside the house. Now, it sounded like a fair number of people, maybe half a dozen, and they were whispering like they were talking among themselves. I heard a little voice in my head saying, "They're awake, knock again." But before I could even dismiss it, I heard the sound of someone laughing inside the house. Not loudly, though, more like a muted sort of wheeze as they tried to keep their voice low. The bad vibes that I was getting ramped up to 11, so instead of risking a confrontation with whoever was either living or more likely squatting there, I decided to make a move. I turned around and walked back up the dirt path as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me. Now, I was quite certain whoever was inside was watching me from those windows, but as long as they didn't follow me, then I didn't mind what they did. I'd almost gotten to the end of the path to where those two wooden gate posts held no gate when I started smelling something strong on the breeze, something that smelled like burning. And then when I turned the corner and could see out onto the road again, I felt this almost involuntary scream jump out of my mouth as I realized what the smell was. It was my car. My car was on fire. Now, I suppose I acted on complete instinct in running over to it because there was absolutely bugger all I could do about putting out that fire. All I could do was just stand there, effing and blinding and looking around for whoever might have done it. But as you can probably guess, there was no one, and the whole area looked deserted. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't. When I realized just how much of a bad situation I truly was in, I started jogging along the road until I got back on the motorway. Now, it was only a 4-lane carriageway, so I could walk along the verge without being in too much danger, but no matter how much danger passing cars posed to me, it still seemed safer than hanging around my burning car in that creepy house. Now, I think probably about a half an hour must have passed with only the odd car going past me, and in that time, I didn't try to get anyone's attention just in case it was the people from the home. I mean, the joke was on them in a sense because that poor Cavalier was definitely on her way out, but on the off chance they wanted to do more than just burn my car, I had to be very careful about who I revealed myself to. Now, I was bloody nervous for that first half an hour, but after that, I started to calm down a wee bit. I hadn't seen any cars or anything parked outside the house, and if they really did want to chase me down for whatever reason, I reckoned that I'd have encountered them already. So once I'd calmed down a bit, and after maybe 2 or 3 more cars passed me with me sticking to the trees on the verge, I made my way to the edge of the road and then stuck my thumb out at what looked like a Land Rover of some kind coming my way. Now, it slowed down as the driver saw me, but then instead of switching on the light above the wheel, someone in the passenger seat started shining a torch in my face after lowering their window. And right away, I knew that wasn't promising behavior when I realized whoever was in the car didn't want to be seen, and I turned and started walking away. Now, a second later, I heard a very promising, "Need a lift, pal?" Now, one that was just friendly enough to slow me down and make me think that I might have been overreacting. But then the second I slowed, I turned back to face the car, and the passenger doors opened up and I heard someone shout, "Get him!" Now, I remember running right at the trees at the side of the road. Not along the road where the car would have been able to cut me off, but at and then through the trees and bushes at the side of the road. I remember closing my eyes as I felt things scratching against my face, and then when I opened them, I found that I'd come to a fence on the other side. I hopped over it with speed and power that I didn't even know I had in me. I mean, I was hardly some couch potato back then, but I wasn't exactly in perfect shape either. But I swear, I think I vaulted that fence like an Olympic athlete for fear of what might have happened if those men had caught up with me. It's strange thinking back on it as well, because these days, all I do sometimes is sit and wonder why those people chose to go after me like they did. But in the moment, as I was running, it didn't matter a jot to me. All I knew was that those people were out to get me, and all that mattered in the world was getting away from them in that moment. Now, I ran across this big dark field for what felt like ages, running and running until I couldn't anymore. And then when I got to the other side and spotted a road ahead of me, I swear I saw that same Land Rover driving along the road with someone shining a torch out into the field. I had to change my route and head off at an angle to avoid the Land Rover, and along with anyone to my rear who might have followed me. I had to force myself to run when I didn't think that I could run anymore, and even though I was quite a fit young lad and one pumped full of adrenaline, I soon felt like that I was about to cough up a lung and fall over. In the end, I found myself staggering onto a road and then right back onto another dark field because I was too scared to be out in the open with a car full of blokes trying to find me. I kept on going like that until I came across a small town. And then as I was walking its dark and empty streets, looking for anyone who might be able to help, a police car appeared, and an officer asked what I was doing walking the streets alone like that. When I told him what had happened to me, he told me to jump in the car, and then off we went to the police station for a cup of hot tea and a few biscuits, while I went into more detail about what had happened. As soon as I mentioned the house that I'd stopped by and mentioned how there had been people inside, I remember these two officers giving each other a look because they told me that the people inside must have been squatters. I thought that they might have been, partly because of how run down the house was, but the police confirmed that it was derelict and that there shouldn't have been anyone in there. They said that they'd head over and check it out, but they doubted anyone would be there. Squatters are kind of like rats. They're annoying and sometimes they're dangerous, but they're not stupid, and they just move on someplace else and then maybe return when things all blew over. But in all likelihood, they were gone from that house for good. I remember asking the two policemen why, as in why had they burned my car before trying to hunt me down like that, and the first words out of the policemen's mouths were, "Well, what did you see?" He was convinced that I'd seen them doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, and after spotting my car, which they assumed was still functional, they tried to make sure that I couldn't get away before chasing me down. But that was the thing. I hadn't seen anything, and once I'd established that, all we could think of was that those squatters just wanted to scare me off. One of the policemen said that since they didn't know who I was, they might have assumed that I was some kind of bailiff or law enforcement agent, and at first they might have been worried that I was a policeman, but then when they realized that I wasn't, they must have reckoned that I was fair game for a kicking, and if only to make sure that I was too scared to return. And with nothing else to say, I gave the police the phone number for my flat in Newcastle, and then, since I literally lost everything but my wallet, one of them was kind enough to give me a lift to a nearby train station. It was long past dawn by then, so the trains were running, and I didn't have to wait long before I was on my way back to Newcastle. They phoned a few days later saying that that house was empty, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence tying anyone to the arson. They promised to keep their ears to the ground and would let me know immediately if there was any progress, but till then, they advised me to be patient because things like that took time. Sadly, that was the last I heard from the police, marking the end of my first encounter with squatters, and hopefully my last too. I had no idea that those people could be so violent. I mean, call me naive, but the squatters I was familiar with were the hippies who took over empty houses in London in the 60s. I thought that they'd be more into peace protests and drum circles than chasing down strangers. But I suppose times had changed then, and people changed with them. Almost 10 years ago now, way back in September of 2016, I drove all the way from LA to Phoenix to visit an old high school friend. Now, I was 31 and female, but still Hispanic and still small, and I drove out on a Friday and we spent all day Saturday together. And then, even though I planned to drive back home in the mid-afternoon on Sunday, I didn't end up leaving until about 9 p.m. at night. Now I know, I should have left earlier, and I know what I'm about to tell you is basically my own damned fault for not sticking to my plan. But even so, there are still nights sometimes, even all this time later, when I find myself waking up from nightmares with a cold sweat forming on my chest, having relived it all over again in my sleep. It was just after midnight when I rolled into Riverside County after passing over the Arizona state line. Now, a few people were still up in that area, so it wasn't completely dead, but after I passed the airport and the Mesa Verde complex, the 10 got super quiet again, and it seemed like there was no one but me out there for miles and miles. I was just trying to keep myself awake with some music and by blasting some cold air when suddenly I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear view. Someone was coming up on me, and really fast too, and seeing how fast they were going, I honestly figured it was the police. I didn't panic or anything, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I didn't have anything in the car that I shouldn't have, and so I just sat tight, kept my speed, and let them get closer and closer. When they got so close their headlights were blinding me if I looked up into the rear view, I figured they'd pass and keep going. But they stayed put, right behind me in the same lane, and didn't budge for at least a couple of minutes. I'm trying to figure out if these guys really are cops, because it looked like they were driving in one of those big sliding door vans. Only this one was all blacked out, like even the windows looked like they were tinted. Now, there was nothing on it to say that they were police, and no lights on the top either, so I started getting really nervous thinking, what the hell do these guys want with me? Like I said, they stayed behind me like that for a couple of minutes, and then by the time they dropped back a little, they sped up to try and pass me, and I was actually super relieved. Now, I thought because they weren't trying to follow anymore, I was out of danger, when in reality, I was in more danger than I could have ever even imagined. I just let them pass, because what the heck was I going to do? But then instead of passing me and speeding off, the black van pulled back into the same lane as me and then started cruising maybe 10 to 15 minutes in front like it was trying to block me. I thought, oh, big deal, right? Like I could just slow down and lose them. But I didn't think that I'd need to, so I didn't. I stayed right where I was, slowing only a little to just a safe distance between us, and then kept on cruising just like the van was. Now, I had no idea what they were up to, and I think maybe curiosity really did almost kill the cat here, because when the van's rear doors swung open, and I saw a man in leathers with some kind of bandana wrapped around his face, I kind of just froze up. I couldn't think of a single good reason why he'd want to open the back doors like that, and for a second I thought that he might be planning on jumping out for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking. All I did was lean on the brake a little and put just a little more feet between myself and that van. I just had no idea that I'd moved right where he wanted me. I dropped back a little more, still wondering what the hell these guys were doing and why they didn't have any plates on the back of their van. I then watched as the man with the bandana around his mouth began to smile at me. I obviously couldn't see his mouth, but I could see it in his eyes. That or the dust was getting to him, because it's like he squinted before turning his back on me and carefully leaning down to grab something. Now, I might sound crazy or dumb to y'all who are reading this back in almost slow-mo, and maybe I was just too tired and slow or naive as heck, but I could not conceive of what he was about to do next, no matter how obvious it seems looking back on it. And so I just watched as the guy hauled something up into his arms, turned around, and then tossed it out onto the freeway in front of him. I saw what it was way too late, and I guess that moment of panic really did slow me down, but I had just enough in me to turn the wheel at just the right moment, so that when that old engine block came bouncing up off the blacktop, it smashed into my windshield on the passenger side and not into me. And once it hit, instinct told me to slam on the brakes, and so that's what I did, bringing my car to a spinning, screeching stop. Before I realized that I was covered in glass and there was basically a giant gaping hole where my windshield used to be. I just remember sitting there and shaking after I turned off my engine, and then I got out, walked to the side of the highway with my phone and dialed 911. And it wasn't until I described exactly what had happened as calmly as I could that I suddenly just broke down when the operator told me to stay on the line while she transferred me to someone. And after that, it was a case of guiding the cops and EMS to where I was so I could be taken to the ER. Aside from a few cuts and some mild whiplash, I was pretty much good to go, but I was reminded of just how lucky I'd been by that doctor. The cops had said the same thing, and that's why I say reminded, but at the time it didn't all the way feel lucky, and it wouldn't for quite some time. I knew I was lucky to be alive, and it wasn't like I was completely blind to how lucky I'd been in that respect, but all I could think about in the months afterwards was, why me? Like, why did they pick me of all the people they could have picked to throw a damn engine at? Like, I know they were trying to kill me. I just want to know what it was about me that made them think, yeah, this is the one. Let's turn her into hamburger meat. The cops didn't find that van or the people inside it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the boys in blue when I say this, but I didn't have much faith that they would. It was a black van, no plates, traveling in the middle of the damn night in the middle of the damn desert, and it might as well have been a ghost. And that fits too, because you know something? It sure as heck haunts me like one. More than 20 years ago now, back when my son James was still in elementary school, we took a trip down to Bethesda, Maryland from New York so he could see his grandma. Now, it was kind of messed up from the start, I guess, because I had something come up at work on the Friday we planned to leave. And this meant that I couldn't get on the road until about 8:30 in the evening, meaning I wouldn't arrive in Bethesda till after midnight at the latest. Now, I called ahead to my mom and made sure that was all okay, and she wasn't happy at having less time with her grandson, but there really wasn't much that could be done. And so after getting her to agree to stay up later than usual, me and James hit the road. About 2 hours into the journey, I stopped at a little gas station in Maryland when I realized I needed a coffee and a bite to eat. James was asleep in the back seat, and I was worried about waking him up as I shut my car door, but he was still at that age where when he was out, and his eyes stayed closed after I shut the door. I got one of those big, super strong gas station coffees, a soda for James, and then a bag of those mini powdered donuts because I knew all that sugar would push me through the rest of the way. And then after walking back to my car, I found James was awake. And thinking that shutting my car door really had woken him up, I apologized and then turned in my seat to hand him his drink. And that's when I saw the key ring that he was now holding. At first glance, it looked like a little clown holding a sign of some description. And I asked him what it was while taking a look at it and saw how the clown's little sign read, Flying Plow Circus. It wasn't plastic either, like it was mass-produced. It was wooden and looked almost handmade. And when I asked James where he got it, he said a man had given it to him. Now, naturally, this didn't ring any alarm bells at first, and I was about to just let it go. But then I asked when the man gave it to him, to which James replied, "A minute ago, while you were in the store." Again, this didn't scare me like it should have, because I'd locked my door. Now, I'd never leave my kid in an unlocked car like that while I went into a store, and since sleepy 6-year-olds aren't the most reliable and frequently play pretend, I didn't really take them seriously. But that's when James said something along the lines of, "Yeah, he did something funny to the door, like, then it opened, then he told us to go visit sometime." Now, I remember my pulse getting faster as I asked James if he was serious, and if he was sure. He told me he wasn't lying, and that the man used some kind of wire to open the door. Now, by the time he said that, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I asked what the guy looked like, and James just said, "Normal." And then as I got out of my car and looked around the parking lot, I don't think I'd ever been so close to a panic attack in my whole life. I tried to calm myself down as best I could, and then I asked James to tell me the whole story again from start to finish. He was starting to pick up on my vibe, so he was starting to get all confused and kind of upset, and I had to assure him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he just needed to tell me what happened, and then he went over it with me a second time. It made my skin crawl to think about, and it still does. The thought of some creep watching people, waiting for an opportunity to break into someone's car so they could creep on their kid. Like, I know all the guy did was give James a keyring, but that's his cover story, right? All he's doing is giving the kid a keyring till the parents take too long coming back, and then it's diddling or abduction time. I asked James if he said or did anything weird, or if he acted in a weird or creepy way, and James said the only weird thing he said was, "Your dad knows me." And even though he was 6, he was skeptical seeing that we didn't even live there. I was freaked out, y'all. The idea of what might have happened scared the hell out of me, but once I saw that there was no one around for me to blame, That fear turned to frustration and then straight up anger. I think if James had pointed someone out like that's him, I'd have straight up torched that dude, and I'd be writing this from prison or something. Not that a jury in their mother effing land would convict me of something like that, but you see my point. I told James to hand me the key ring, and then told him if anything like that ever happened again, he should yell for me, as loud as he could, and he wasn't to stop until I'd appeared to protect him. I told him he'd been very brave and he hadn't done anything wrong, and then gave him the speech on how not everyone who acts friendly wants to be friends. And then once all that was said and done and my heart rate had returned to normal, sort of, we got back on the road again. I remembered the name of the road that I was on a couple of minutes later because I looked it up later when I decided to call the cops. It was called Conowingo Road, a name I don't think I'll ever forget because I was driving down and I saw the sign saying Flying Plow Circus 1 mile ahead. I remember how the rage boiled up in me like you wouldn't believe, and I actually put my foot down thinking I'm going to give these a-holes a piece of my mind. I powered along the highway, probably dipping over the speed limit a couple of times till I finally found the sign saying Flying Plow Circus next right. I don't know exactly what I was planning. Maybe just find where the carnies' trailers were, then curse up a storm on how they needed to keep a leash on their pedo co-workers before he gets himself shot. I wasn't dumb enough to start a fight with a whole bunch of random circus folk, and I wasn't about to let their buddy get away with what he did either. But then after making the turn and driving down this dark dirt road to where a circle of trailers were sat, I changed my mind completely. If I could describe that collection of trailers in 2 words, those 2 words would be horror and movie. And there was a fire in the middle of them and a bunch of people gathered around it. And then when they saw my car, I saw a couple of them turn to look at me. I couldn't make much out. They were just these dark shapes with the fire in the background, but that made them even creepier looking. I realized that it might not be a case of one rogue carny, and for all I know, the whole gang might have sent that one guy out looking for a kid to snatch and bring back to them. Now I just kept on watching them, watching me for maybe half a minute more, and then after taking one look at James in the back, who by then had fallen back asleep, I thought, screw this, and then turned around and drove off. Now before James was born, if something like that happened where someone made me mad enough to hunt them down, then yeah, maybe I'd have gotten my car and been dumb enough to get my ass kicked by a dozen pissed off carnival folk. But after he was born, it was like I had this safety software installed onto my brain where everything I did sparked the thought of, how is this going to end for me? There was no point trying to defend him from something I wouldn't survive confronting, because being a parent is literally all about living to fight another day. Life's not a game anymore for me. I have to do everything I can to protect my kid, and it's just scary as hell when you try and do all the right things and still end up with some creep breaking into your car. I called the cops from my mom's place that next day after telling her all about the man, the key ring, and all the signs from the Flying Plow Circus. They called me back basically saying that they'd been stonewalled and that no one admitted to slipping out from their camp after dark, not even for a second. And that's what confirmed it for me. If they were just a bunch of innocent, good-natured carnies just making their way in the world, then I doubt that they'd have stonewalled a pair of cops who came around asking about a kitty creeper. If there was some sketchy loner on my crew and I thought that they were up to no good, and I mean really up to no good, I'd want them gone. So the fact that they all sort of said, "I don't know what you're talking about, officers," and that made me think that they were in on it and they were just covering for their boy. On the journey back from my mom's and while driving in daylight, I slowed near that turn that I'd seen the trailers on but didn't see any signs for the Flying Plow Circus. Now, I'm guessing that they moved on after the visit from the cops, and after looking it up, I don't think the whole Flying Plow thing was their regular name. Flying Plow something, I can't remember if it was a road or a lane or whatever, was the name of the place that they set up on, so wherever they went, they'd probably put up some new signs and under a new name, and then on they'd go. I don't even know if they were running an actual circus. I saw plenty of trailers, but no big top. But what I do know is that one of them went out looking for kids, and almost certainly for no good reason at all. My name's Hank. I'm a proud Texan, and I work as a bus driver taking folks all over this great state of ours. Most of those journeys take place during the day, but sometimes I like to earn a little extra pay by taking the overnight journeys, or what you might call the red eyes. I fire up that big old rig around dusk, load her up with the sleepy travelers heading either home or away, and then take off along those long, lonely highways that stretch from Houston to El Paso and every place in between. I wouldn't call it a difficult job, but as long as you can keep the wheels turning through the witching hours and dodge all those back road deer, you can almost guarantee everybody gets where they're going safe and sound by sunup. And it's not often the bus causes you problems, because if you keep her clean and well-oiled, and she'll keep you moving and happy. It's the people that complicate things, though. Not every kind of person, but a certain kind, and all the worst rides have been down to that certain kind of person. Including this one, which was probably the worst I have ever experienced. Driving the bus across Texas at night with nothing but country songs and the stars to keep me company, it sometimes makes me feel like a night watchman, one charged with guarding the whole damn state. Now, I meet all kinds of interesting people on that open road under the big Texas sky, and then watching the sun rise over the prairies after a long shift, it's pure gold, but the cons hit hard too. Your sleep schedule gets all turned around, so whenever you're working nights, you miss out double on family dinners and weekends with the kids. The fatigue creeps up on you too, and dealing with rowdy passengers or breakdowns in the middle of nowhere is no picnic. But every so often, you get a special kind of rowdy. The kind that's not just drunk and loud or complaining about fellow passengers' body odor. The kind that's dangerous. Real dangerous. Back during the fall of 2007, I was on a run from Dallas to Austin, driving through the pitch black with nothing but tumbleweeds and truck stops for miles. I had this fella riding with me about 6 rows back, one that had been staring out the window and kind of muttering to himself, at least according to a fellow passenger anyway. I couldn't hear him at first, so it must have been nothing but a few grumbles and not enough to cause a scene. But then after maybe an hour on the road, I started hearing him as he started to raise his voice. I looked up into my mirror to see folks shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody said a word. That happens more often than not. People learn to tune out the oddballs on long bus rides like that, but the guy didn't get any quieter. He only got louder, and as he did, the tension in the air got thicker and thicker. My guy twisted something fierce knowing trouble was simmering, and I just prayed that it'd blow over, sort of like a false alarm, but it didn't. When it came, the guy went off like a firecracker on the 4th of July, almost like his fuse was sizzling away for a while, and then bang, off he went, and there was no stopping him. I heard someone say something to him, I guess a sort of shut up or something to that effect, and the guy replied with a full-throated roar, and then went at that challenger like a freaking skunk pig. I looked back for just a second to see him leaning across the center aisle, lunging at the person I assumed did the back-talking. I had to keep my eyes on the road, but I looked up into the mirror to see fists raining down, and then the sound of passengers screaming along with a doom, doom, doom of the big guy's fists against the other's face. They weren't fighting. It was like a beating. The kind that, if it wasn't stopped, was going to end in a casket and a family dressed in black. The bus exploded into chaos as the beating continued, with some people running for cover toward the rear and others charging the attacker to try and end the assault. And when he realized what was going on, the attacker sort of wheeled around and started swinging on the folks trying to stop him. And let me tell you, this man was no small specimen. From what I could tell, he made short work of the people trying to stop him, and I think he straight up knocked a guy out too, because something freed him up to go back to wailing on the first guy he attacked, who by then was out cold and leaking blood from his nose and mouth. I didn't get a picture of all of this until later, obviously, because I was mostly trying to keep my eyes on the road while keeping an eye on the situation behind me using my driver's mirror. But then as soon as I realized the violence wasn't about to stop anytime soon, I started slowing us down so I could pull us over and get as many people as possible off that bus. I didn't hit the brakes in a sort of screaming tires kind of way. You can't do that on the bus with people standing unless you want them falling head first. And while I didn't mind if our psycho attacker banged his head on an armrest, I had to consider the other passengers too. I brought the bus to the side of the road as fast as I could, which felt painfully slow given what was happening right behind me. And then once we'd come to a stop, I opened up the doors and began hollering for people to get out as quickly as they could. I think I herded about 12 to 14 people out of the front, and there were women clutching their children, a couple of old-timers who couldn't move as fast, but everyone else moved like greased lightning. Everyone except the people trapped on the back of the bus who were being blocked from the front exit by our raging psycho. We had an emergency exit at the back of the bus, so I started yelling at the people in the back to pull the lever and push the door open so they could all scramble out onto the road. I don't know if they just couldn't hear what I was saying over the sound of their screams, or they were too scared to turn their backs on that attacker, but they didn't do as I asked. I kept on yelling louder and louder, but then the psycho turned his attention to me and then came charging down the bus while roaring like some beast. I tried to put something between us, that something being the driver's seat, but as most of you can probably imagine, all he had to do was move a yard to the side and his fists had unfettered access to my face. I felt a couple of punches and kicks, but all I could do was try and shield my head in the hopes that he didn't do any serious damage. At one point, the guy actually grabbed one of my arms by the wrist and pulled it away so he could punch me right in the eye. All it took was one punch, and it felt like I couldn't see out of it anymore, and I knew it'd only take a couple of more of that to do some serious damage. The same pattern played out again, with people trying to get him off of me before being beaten back, and then he turned back to me and started all over again, but he didn't last long because maybe a second or two later all I heard was, "Hey, right here!" It was a young voice, almost sounded a bit like a kid's, and then bam, there was a gunshot, and then I heard that attacker start to groan. I looked around, the vision in my right eye still kind of cloudy, and I saw the attacker was curled up on the floor of the bus near the exit stairs, and he was clutching at his belly with a blood stain getting bigger and bigger on his shirt. Standing over him was this black kid with a gun, and I say kid as he must have been in his late teens, probably early 20s, but there he was, standing over the guy with a smoking pistol, telling him if he tried to get up, he'd blow his head off. With the attacker put down, and with all the fight having left him, the other passengers were able to get off the bus. People were treating the kid with the gun like he was some hero, but all he seemed interested in was getting out of there. I told him to hold his horses because the cops wouldn't arrest a man for defending people like he did, but he turned to me and, with a sort of scared look in his eye, he says, "It ain't legal. It ain't legal, man. I gotta go now." And then off he went. Lord knows where, and that's honestly the last I saw of him. With folks huddled outside in the cold, yes, Texas nights can get cold, I called in what had just happened on my cell and then waited with the rest while they either cried, hugged each other, or just stared into space like I did, wondering how the heck things all went so bad so fast. And not long after, we all saw lights flashing red and blue across the flatlands, and then as they got closer, they were joined by sirens. State troopers rolled up first. Their guns were drawn so they could secure the scene, and then I gave them the lowdown on that berserker. I mentioned the shooter too, and I know I should have been honest with them, and I might have been a little selective over what I remembered because God knows I didn't want that kid's good deed treated like a bad one. Once the cops had the scene secure, the EMTs came right behind them. They hauled off that unconscious fellow with his face all busted up and then stretchered off that young woman too, the one the attacker had given a few hard licks. And they even checked the attacker too, who was still alive but in a lot of pain, and then with him handcuffed to a stretcher, they took him away with a cop sitting in the back of the ambulance with him. The cops questioned everybody, taking statements while I stood there feeling like I'd aged a decade in about an hour. And the company I worked for got a replacement bus out to us as quickly as they could, and then once the dust settled and the authorities cleared us to go, we were back on the road again. We were minus a couple of passengers because some had chosen to wait for kin or friends so they could ride with them instead, but we were also plus one because I got to sit back and enjoy the ride with the new driver at the wheel. The atmosphere on the bus now was pretty dark, with folks whispering to each other about what had just happened. But I preferred the talk because, when it came, the silence was honestly heavier than a lead blanket. I still think about that kid sometimes, the one who shot our attacker before he could do any serious damage to me. I guess if you told me about a guy like that walking around with an illegal gun, I'd have assumed that he was the bad guy. And I guess he sort of was one of the bad guys if he was a felon or what have you. But then all it took was one pull of the trigger at that right moment, and he became kind of a hero to me. I know there's no such thing as a perfect person, but since that night, I've never been so convinced of the existence of flawed heroes. So I used to drive taxis in Liverpool back in the 80s. Now, it was great money for what it was, and so even though I only planned on doing it long enough to find a replacement for the job I'd lost, I ended up driving for almost 3 years before I finally gave up. A big appeal was that I could work when I wanted. If I had something that I needed doing in the daytime, be it something with the kids' school or whatever, I could just take a few hours off, take care of business, and then head out on the jobs again at night to make up the hours. And there was no doing that in a factory or down on the docks, not without getting your pay docked anyway. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and I remember one particular job where for a minute or two, it didn't look like I was going to make it home to my family that night. It started when a job came through just after 10 p.m., asking me to take someone from Agberth Vale to Anfield. I got the address, drove over, and then parked up outside a small 2-up, 2-down on a dark and quiet street. I didn't want to beat my horn, which was the usual method of letting a customer know that we were outside, so I gave dispatch a buzz on my radio and asked them to call the customer back to let them know that I was waiting. Dispatch said no one picked up the phone, but then maybe a second or two later, I saw someone walking out of a house and towards my car. Now, as I said, it was dark, so even though I saw the shape of them moving towards the back passenger door, I didn't get a good look at them until they were sitting behind me, and when I did, I almost pissed my kecks. He was wearing a balaclava, and after he shut the door, he sank down low in the seat to make it harder for him to be seen from the outside. Now, he had what looked like a jerry can of petrol in one gloved hand, and then with the other, he pulled out what looked like an old detective gun from his jacket, like a proper six-shooter, and pointed it directly at me. He said if I tried to run, I'd be shot. In fact, if I did anything that even remotely upset him, I was a dead man. Now, my only job was to do what he said, and when he said it, and if I did, I'd go home alive that night. And so, seeing as I didn't have much of a choice, I drove where he told me to go. We ended up parked up across from a pub not far from the Rialto on Upper Parliament Street, I remember, and the lad in the back told me to turn off the engine and then spent the next 15 minutes or so checking his watch and peering up over the solid part of the door to watch the pub through the window. He kept on checking his watch, and I kept getting the urge to try and talk him out of whatever he was about to do. But every time the words were about to come out, something stopped them. I stayed quiet, and then noticed that when the clock on my dash hit 11 p.m., the lad in the back started getting even twitchier. When I noticed people coming out of the pub, obviously around kick-out time, the lad told me to start the engine. He was watching the pub doors like a hawk, and then suddenly, he started rolling down the window all frantically before he pointed the gun out the window, shouted something I couldn't make out, and pulled the trigger. One of the fellas who just walked out of the pub hit the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. Someone screamed, and then the guy in the back seat let out a scream of his own as he told me to drive. I obviously had to stay under the speed limit where possible, but it was tough with a gun pressed in the back of my head every so often, with its owner telling me that if I stopped for the police or took us down any dead ends, I'd be getting one to the back of the dome. The lad directed me to drive all the way out towards Speke to some of the derelict land near where the airport is today. He told me to get out of the car and then started emptying that can of petrol all over the seats after joining me outside. And that was the closest I had got to trying to do something when I realized that I was about to lose my car. I know that probably sounds horrible, seeing as I didn't do anything about him shooting that fella outside the pub, but I wasn't really in any position to do anything back then, whereas watching him pour that gasoline with his back to me, I knew that there was a very slim chance that I'd be able to get the drop on him. But if I didn't, I was a dead man. And so I basically talked myself out of it in my head and then watched as he set my car on fire and then ran off into the darkness. I just remember feeling numb. Less than an hour before, I hadn't even received the job yet, And then just a short while after parking outside that house to pick them up, my life had been changed forever. We obviously didn't have any phones back then, so I couldn't just call the police with a mobile like I would now. I had to walk all the way to a payphone, which took quite a while before I could contact the police, and only then could I give them any details. All I wanted to do was go home, get in the bath, and crack open one of the beers that I had waiting for me in the fridge. But the police wanted me to wait where I was so I could guide them to where my car had been dumped. It honestly didn't take all that long, and I'm grateful the police got out to me so fast, but the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back to where my car was still smoldering and repeat my story for a second time. But I had to, because the most important thing was making it really bloody clear that my part in the murder was an unwilling one, and I did that by giving them as much info as possible on the man that had done the shooting. But when they asked if I'd be willing to appear in a court at a later date, I told them no. Call me a coward, but to me, you'd have to be mental to testify against some gangster in this city. Maybe if I was in London or New York or somewhere like that, but not Liverpool, because everyone knows everyone round here. And they said that I might get asked again if murder detectives were put on the case and they found someone they wanted to charge. But the fact that I never got that call is the only proof that I need that they didn't catch anyone. I used to have nightmares about it too, proper horrible ones as well. But nowadays I just have these dreams. Not quite nightmares, but still clear enough for me to remember when I wake up in the morning. And sometimes in those dreams I do what I wanted to do in the moment and beg the killer to reconsider. But no matter what I say and no matter how I say it, he never, ever listens. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your own story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the beacons are lit. Gondor calls for aids. In the late 19th century, the legendary Irish playwright Oscar Wilde wrote, "There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want, and the other is getting it." This is a story about the second kind of tragedy. So my name here is not important. All you need to know is that for many years, I worked as a journalist in my native Brazil. I grew up under the military dictatorship, and while I was never a communist myself, I was greatly inspired by the story of a man called Vlado. Originally from Croatia, Vlado was a Marxist who moved to Brazil to become a journalist, and after the military took power, he was a constant thorn in their side. In the end, they faked his disappearance and presumably ended his life. Words alone made them so weak that they took his life. And it's no exaggeration to say that inspired a whole generation of young journalists, myself being one of them. The way up was hard work and very boring sometimes. I mean, no disrespect to the good people I reported on, but when you sign up to cover corruption and scandal, having to cover which block party served the best street food gets a little tedious and very fattening. I had a lot of fun and met a lot of great people too, but I wasn't truly fulfilled in my profession. I wanted my work to help bring positive change to the country, but getting paid to write about politics at the time was completely impossible. My future laid down two paths: football or crime, and in my foolishness I chose crime. The dictatorship liked us reporting on crime, especially things like murder and robbery, because it made people scared. And long story short, painting the people they disappeared as murder victims put pressure on the police to solve the crimes. They couldn't because their killers were the dictators, but this put a kind of subtle pressure on them and proved a safe form of social activism. And that's how I came to be investigating the actual murder, not just disappearance, of a man named Rodrigo. Without saying too much, Rodrigo's killer was never found. But years later, ballistic analysis showed the prime suspects were two hitmen, imprisoned following a gangland murder. But that brand new data also showed that the pistol which killed Rodrigo was the same one that killed quite a prominent corporate attorney. Now, the police either hadn't seen the connection or refused to, but when I looked into what the attorney had been working on before he was killed, what I found was shocking. I discovered that a huge lawsuit was about to be filed against one of Brazil's biggest logging companies, pertaining to the violent persecution of Amazon tribespeople who lived on land the company wanted. I started researching the connections between the company and the criminal underworld, and without saying too much, I found what looked to be an irrefutable one. My editor realized how big the story was. He knew my life would be in danger if I wrote it, and he knew the paper didn't have the resources to protect me if I did. And so instead, he contacted a friend of his, and this is where the story gets crazy. My editor's old friend ran a much bigger newspaper in the state capital, one that would be very interested in running a story about corporate murder. But he wasn't the only one, which is how a very prominent Brazilian musician stepped in and offered to house me in his country retreat while I wrote the article that would expose the corruption. It was a very generous offer and one that I had no choice but to accept, especially since he was offering me half of his security team to keep me safe at his expense. It was very much a whirlwind in that respect. Everything moved so fast and with such big names being thrown around, and then before I knew it, I was being driven deep into the Amazon to spend a week working in solitude, but more importantly, safety. Because if the megacorps would kill a low-level worker like Rodrigo to keep their dirty secrets from the public, there's no telling what they would do to me. After a long car ride into the jungle, I had to travel by motorboat up the river for several hours. Our singer's retreat was located in an area that was not accessible by road, and was what's known as Casas de Caboclo. These are simple wooden homes built on stilts at the edge of a clearing and with a thatched roof and open sides covered by screens. Now, I was aware that I'd be living in such a place while writing my article. The singer said it was where he went after long periods on tour so he could decompress and bring himself back down to earth. But as was explained to me, humbling himself involved living with no electricity, no telephone connection, and only a primitive sort of well from which to draw drinking water. It was completely off the grid, as people might say today, and while I knew that living there would prove a challenge, I felt safe, and that counted for a lot. And for the most part, the reason I felt so safe was because of how isolated and secluded I was. The surrounding area was dense rainforest with tall trees, thick undergrowth, and vines so thick that it made some places impassable. The ground was constantly wet and muddy, which made life unbearable at times, but the sounds of the jungle were incredible. You could hear birds and insects and howler monkeys calling throughout the day, but at night, the jungle truly came alive. The Amazon is like a Rio Favela, a nocturnal place, slow and humid in the daytime, but wild once the sun goes down. Some nights it was so noisy that I found it impossible to sleep, especially when I could hear something screaming in mortal agony after being ambushed by a jaguar. They'd scream and then suddenly, nothing, as the beast sank its teeth into its victim's neck and silenced it forever. The river ran behind the house, wild, brown, and slow-moving. Locals used it for transport, fishing, and bathing, and while it took me a full week before I felt brave enough to wash in waters containing candiru, the tiny parasitic fish rumored to swim up men's urethras, I mostly used the river as a relaxing backdrop for my daily exercise. This consisted of an hour's walking after lunch, sandwiched by 2 long writing sessions, after which I'd return to the small wooden table and chair and continue compiling the evidence into the article I hoped would change my country for the better. Now, the isolation helped with focus, but the heat and insects made it tiring, so to energize myself for the afternoon writing session, I'd take a walk by the riverbank and sometimes take a dip to cool off. I didn't bathe on the occasion in question. I simply walked by the riverbank enjoying the solitude and listening to the sounds of the jungle. But in an instant, those sounds suddenly changed. It wasn't uncommon to hear howler monkeys hooting and screeching in the jungle. Day or night, you'd hear them calling out whenever a predator was nearby, and you could always tell when that predator was a big cat because the monkeys would go crazy up there in the trees and would take flight more often than not. Now, this is because big cats like jaguars or pumas are highly efficient killers, and if they're spotted on the move, it usually means they're hunting. But a howler monkey's reaction to a human being is very different, as I learned myself while walking under a tree full of them. They're well aware of how dangerous humans can be, so they call out loudly as you approach them. And they don't just run. They know you can't climb trees like they or a big cat can, so if you walk slowly and quietly and don't make any sudden movements, they'll just simply watch you from above, sounding out only the occasional call to communicate your position to the other members of their troop. And that is what I heard that day, maybe 50 or 60 yards away in the jungle as I walked alone on this muddy path. Now, at first I thought it was a jaguar, in which case I needed to pick up my pace a little to make it back to the house. But when I recognized how familiar the monkey's reaction was to me and realized that there was another person walking through the jungle with me, I felt my heart sinking in my chest. No one was supposed to be out there. No one was supposed to know that I was there. And so the fact that someone appeared to be shadowing me at a distance, it had me fearing for my life. I rushed back to the house as fast as I could. I took a large revolving pistol from under the bed and waited by the window with it, peeping out for any sign that someone was following me. I decided I'd simply given myself a little scare, and it was very unusual to hear or see another person out there, even on the river, but it wasn't impossible that someone was just passing through. Besides, I believed if someone had come all that way, they wouldn't want to hang around and I'd have been attacked already. I skipped my exercise walk for that day, and then the next I walked the opposite way along the river just to be careful. There were no signs of any other people on that walk, and none for the next couple of days too. But then, just less than a week after the howler monkeys indicated their presence, it happened again. I was a smoker at the time, so I was having a ration of cigarettes to get me through. Now, sometimes I felt like I'd happily surrender to the hitmen if it meant getting one last smoke, like they do in the movies. And then when my supply of cigarettes started to get damp and moldy, I had to salvage what I could and dry them out in the sun before I was able to smoke them. I suppose this ordeal might sound pathetic to people who have never been addicted to nicotine, but when I say the cravings are awful, please take my word for it. You become hypersensitive to the smell of a cigarette and become especially sensitive to the scent of tobacco smoke. Which is why, when I was walking through the jungle one day, and I smelled it on the breeze, I was hit by two immediate sensations, one of envy and one of terror. Now, it seems so silly to look back on, but my first thought really was, I need to find this guy so I can ask him for a cigarette. But then reality hit me, and so did the fear. Knowing I wasn't alone again and that someone was close, it scared the hell out of me, most of all because they weren't moving, and they weren't making any noise, and that meant that there was a distinct possibility that they were watching me. I thought I was dead, and as I ran I knew I could only hear the shot if it was a wound and not a kill. I expected everything to just go dark, for existence itself to become non-existence in the time it took to pull a trigger. But as I ran and ran, slamming through the trees, no shot came and I made it back to the house. Now, I immediately went for the gun, then after grabbing a few things and throwing them into my backpack, I ran along the riverbank in the opposite direction to the smoke. In the event that I believed that I'd been compromised, we had a system in place to secure my evacuation. I was to head out into the jungle to where a pre-planned dead drop had been designated. All I had to do was take a rock that had been placed on the ground and shove it into the nook of the tree it lay under. The security company responsible for protecting me said they'd check the dead drop every evening. Then if I'd signaled danger, they'd immediately send a boat and an escort to evacuate me. But if the house was compromised, I couldn't exactly go back to it, not unless I could be sure that it was clear. And so instead of returning to it, I was to run to a tree house the musician had constructed some time ago. It wasn't at all comfortable, and it was so infested with bugs, molds, and fungus that I didn't even try to get any sleep. And even if the place had been pristine, sleep was an impossibility. I stayed awake all night, tuned into all the sounds of the jungle. It might sound counterintuitive, but I was less scared of all those sounds by then. I had come to understand that terrible symphony of nocturnal warfare, and so I felt more confident I could identify the sounds of another human. But even so, the experience was a terrifying one, and I will never forget just how terrible it was to be hunted, with only a revolver I could barely shoot to defend myself. I prayed to God that nothing or no one wishing me harm would find me, and it appears that He listened, if only for that night. I made it to dawn without hearing or seeing anything strange, and then with a pistol at the ready, I made my way back towards the house. Now that was the second time I believed that I'd be shot dead, and it was no easier to deal with than the first time. I had absolutely no confidence in myself to outshoot a trained killer, and even as I approached slowly, carefully, and in a wide arc, my heart was pounding in my chest, because I believed that at any moment my life would end in the blink of an eye. Yet it didn't, and slowly but surely I was able to advance from tree to tree until I spotted the house, along with a man waiting outside of it. He looked professional, like he was from the security company, but in my paranoia I couldn't be sure. I kept quiet as I could, getting closer and closer with him none the wiser. Then I emerged from the foliage with the gun drawn, trying to look like I was skilled with it. I called out to him and asked who he was, and when he saw me, he raised his hands but kept a smile on his face as he told me to keep calm and that he was from the company. Now he knew the name of the company, and he knew my name, and he seemed aware that the dead drop had been triggered. He pointed to the house and asked if the article I was writing was inside. I said yes, and then he told me to collect it, and then and only then did I lower my gun. I thanked him for showing up as I walked past him, and then started telling him about the smoke. I remember asking him, "Was that you?" And I guess when he shook his head, he really was telling the truth. But in the moment, I didn't understand the significance. Now I remember I then turned my back and placed the gun on the bed so I could collect my things, but no sooner had I stepped away from it, I heard a heavy click. I turned to see my would-be escort had pulled his gun from his holster and was in the process of pointing it at me. And so reacting on pure instinct, I threw my heavy dictaphone towards him and then lunged for a nearby window. I guess hurtling my dictaphone at him was enough to throw his aim off, because all but one of his shots missed as I tumbled through the paneless window and out onto the porch outside. But the one that struck had me screaming in agony. It went right through, splitting my shin bone in the process and crippling me. I was only able to crawl from the porch and into the mud, trying and failing to find my feet in the vain hope that I might be able to hop my way to safety. But I was never going to get away, and as I began to realize that my time on this earth might well be up, the only thoughts in my head were those of my mother. I rolled over onto my back in a sort of fruitless attempt to plead with my executioner, but after walking out of the house and rounding the corner, I could see in his eyes that there was no reasoning with him. I tried anyway, watching as he raised his gun, and then he stopped and I heard a shot. But instead of my whole world going dark or a white-hot shock of pain going through me, I watched with a raised and trembling hand as my would-be killer fell dead. I was still trembling as I heard footsteps coming from behind me, and as I turned to look, I saw a man wearing what looked like regular everyday clothes walking out from the trees. No, he too knew my name, and then after asking me to confirm it, he got to work bandaging my leg with one of my own t-shirts. When he'd finished gathering up my things, he helped me limp to the boat that would transport me back to civilization, and then from there, I was taken to a hospital where I went into surgery to save my leg. Survival is one hell of a feeling, and it gives you all the cliched second leases on life like the movies say it does. But an even better feeling came when I had my article published, an article which whipped up so much of a storm the politicians promised a crackdown on corporate criminality. Sadly, not everyone who should have gone to prison went to prison, but to get even a shred of justice for the victims is a victory, because that's who we're fighting for when all is said and done, right? People like Rodrigo, who I mentioned earlier. People whose lives were valued at less than the company's bottom line. This is one of the hardest things I've ever had to write, but I've been encouraged to do so by both my family and some highly qualified medical professionals too. So in the hopes that it'll help me process it better, I'm going to try. Nearly 8 years ago, my family's whole world was turned upside down by the sudden and unexpected death of my brother Tom. We grew up here in England, and he was the eldest by 4 years. He was a great big brother, and we always got along, but our interests couldn't have been any different. I was in my late teens when he died, so still very much in my Florence and the Machine and Sims 3 era, but Tom was doing a history degree at uni. And while he'd always been into stuff like the Vikings and the Romans, going to uni obviously took things to a whole new level. After his second year, when he came home for the summer, he was obsessed with medieval Europe. But his stay proved only a pit stop because many months prior, he'd organized a 6-week stay in a replica medieval village up in the Scottish Highlands. Now, I thought that sounded right up his alley, so I was happy for him. But then the more I heard about it, the more it sounded a little bit too intense for my taste, because when they said replica village, they meant replica village. It wasn't a holiday camp by any stretch. It was a serious historical reenactment set up and funded by some Scottish university, and they weren't just doing it for a laugh either. There were no phones, no modern toilets, no electricity, and no running water. Once you were in the village, any preference to events after a certain year warranted a warning. And then once you had 3 warnings, you were quite literally banished from the village. Tom said that they were trying to maintain perfect test conditions so that the things they experienced would be the things their medieval ancestors experienced. Now that way they could understand their problems better and gain a greater understanding of the medieval way of life. Like I said, it sounded like a dream holiday in many ways, and seeing him off was a laugh because we were all making jokes about him speaking Old English upon his return, or waving a sword about and calling for a crusade every time the local miscreants started throwing eggs or toilet paper around the estate. Tom said he'd call us when he got there, as in before he had to hand his phone in, and then he'd call us 6 weeks after when he got it back. Now, we're all really excited to hear from him, and then after 5 weeks, we were counting the days until we got that call from him. But then only about 3 or 4 days before Tom was due to come home, we got a call from a police officer up in Scotland who had some devastating news for us. While Tom and a few other villagers had been out hunting, they'd been walking along the crest of a hill when Tom slipped. Now, the slope wasn't exceptionally steep, so he might have been able to steady himself after a couple of tumbles, but after smashing his head on a rock almost immediately after slipping, he'd been knocked unconscious, and after tumbling down the hill, he was found with a broken neck. The villagers abandoned protocol to try and save his life and had the caretaker, the man who took everyone's phones, call 999 before rushing to the scene with a first aid kit. But there's nothing in a first aid kit that can fix a broken neck, and we were told that only maybe a minute or 2 after he slipped and fell, Tom was dead. It was all just so tragic. The villagers couldn't move him because he'd suffered a head injury, but neither could the ambulance service actually access the village because the roads turned to narrow, muddy tracks running through woodland, and it was those the villagers used to access their homes. Tom was lying there for about an hour before an air ambulance showed up to take him to hospital, but by then, he'd stopped breathing for almost 45 minutes and there was no saving him. The police officer Mom and Dad spoke to said his fellow villagers were absolutely devastated, and a few of them actually wrote to us, pen and paper letters too, saying how sorry they were and how lovely Tom was and that their hearts were just broken like ours were. It was a really nice gesture, to be honest, and those letters meant a lot to me. So much so that I read one of them at his funeral about 2 weeks later. I had to read it through a flood of tears, but I did manage to finish, and everyone said afterwards how beautifully written the letter had been. But now, after my dad announced an email had arrived in his inbox, written by a former member of the village, I'm struggling to decide how to feel about them and what to do with them. And for the second time in 10 years, our entire world was turned upside down. The email had been written by a girl named Sarah, who claimed to have been present at the village at the time of Tom's death. Then, after a string of apologies and claims she wished things could have been different, Sarah had a horrifying confession to make. Tom's death wasn't an accident. He'd been murdered. Sarah explained that he too had been a big history buff and was studying the subject at St. Andrews University when she heard about the replica village. She was told all the same things, that it was a serious reconstruction for the purposes of academic study, and that as long as you followed the rules, a person could learn a whole lot about the past and themselves, and all while having fun doing it. She signed up, was given her arrival date, and then, while the first few days proved a proper shock to the system for her, she eventually found her rhythm and started to really enjoy herself. There was just one big problem, and that was how some of the villagers seemed to be a lot more willing to get into character, as it were, than others. The Middle Ages were not a great time to be a woman or someone who didn't believe in God, and I'm not trying to score some political points by saying this, it's just the truth. And so in order to get actually into character and create the physical and mental conditions by which 14th century peoples lived, the occupant of the replica village tried really hard to get into that headspace. But some tried much, much harder than others. Sarah said the choice punishment for minor infractions was beating, and if the newer villagers didn't place their faith and trust entirely in God, the older villagers treated them like dirt until they came around and started talking and praying like a true Christian. What's more, some of the older villagers weren't at the end of their 6-week stay. They'd been there for literally years, having thrown away their old, more complicated modern lives in favor of living hundreds of years in the past. Now you can get a sense of what Sarah is trying to say in her email before she comes out and says it. When she does, it's not any less shocking. She said the village wasn't just some academic pursuit, and while it might have started that way, it had long since devolved into a kind of off-the-grid cult. Women who'd been beaten or even violated were essentially told that if they went to the police, the entire village would rally around their abuser and ensure that there were no arrests or convictions. The villagers also made it clear that they'd launch a kind of counter-accusation campaign to discredit and demoralize anyone who tried to blow the whistle. Their lives and academic careers would be destroyed systematically. And so with that sword of Damocles hanging over everyone, it took a long time for anyone to find the strength to come forward, which in my opinion made Sarah an exceptionally courageous young woman. There were literally pages and pages describing the dark underbelly of the replica village, and only once she'd really set the scene did Sarah get into what happened to Tom. According to her, he'd taken a real exception to the way some of the villagers were treating their wives, to the point an argument with a village elder had come to blows. The elder punched Tom, Tom punched him back, but then instead of rolling around on the floor like they were in a drunken street brawl, the other male villagers jumped Tom, beat him until he was barely conscious, and then locked him in the village jail for a few days of prayer and reflection, but without any food or water. Sarah said it was the standard procedure for anyone who threatened to blow the whistle, and that each and every time the experience broke them. But by broke them, Sarah didn't mean that they were simply starved into submission, because if that was the case, People would just fake being well again, scarf down a bowl of stew, and then leg it back to the groundskeeper's hut to grab their phone and call the police. But that's not how the village did things. They were smart about it. They had people sit there outside your holding cell, praying for you constantly, and then anyone who unlocked the door to give them food would say things like, "We're praying for you. We can't wait for you to come back to us. We miss you so much." Things like that. It was brainwashing, pure and simple, but from that point on, everything became so horribly clear. Tom was probably the most independent-minded person I'd ever known, or as my dad sometimes called him, a right stubborn bastard is that boy. And if he set his mind on something, it wasn't often that he didn't get it or it didn't happen, which is why I didn't doubt him for a second when he mentioned doing something mental like living in the 14th century for a month and a half. If he decided he was going to do it, Tom got it done. So when Sarah wrote that after 3 days with no food and water, Tom seemed a changed man, I thought, yeah, seemed being the operative word here. I knew in my heart of hearts, having known him for 17 years of my life, that he'd be broken by any such treatment. So when Sarah said that she believed he'd been killed to keep him quiet, and that he hadn't slipped on that hunt that evening, he'd been pushed, I believed it. He was so strong-headed that he couldn't even pretend. Like the time Mum and Dad dragged him to a panto when I was 8, and he was so angry he refused to crack a smile, even when the bloke playing Rumpelstiltskin all but begged him to. And so it made total sense that after however long, pretending he was one of them as it were, the mask slipped and he made his feelings plain. Sarah said that she thought Tom was caught unawares, that the hunting trip itself might have been a ruse to get him somewhere his killers could fake his accidental death. But I saw it differently. I saw Tom snapping, unable to keep his mouth shut any longer, and then after either slagging off the village, saying he was going to the police, or a scathing combination of the two, I think someone pushed him, and that's how he died. It wasn't some tragic accident. They weren't sorry for our loss. They killed him. My brother was murdered. At least that's what this Sarah person wants us to believe, but I don't even know if I want what she's saying to be true. It might sound horrible, but having Tom's death dragged up like this has been such a mix of emotions. Like I thought I finally had a lid on my grief, and that after putting all that trauma behind me, I'd be left only with my happy memories. And then that email came out of the blue, and it was like a bomb was dropped on us. I want to believe this Sarah girl is for real and that she's finally seen sense and done the right thing. But if this place really does make people go mad and turn into the most paranoid, superstitious, and hateful versions of themselves, then how do I know she's not making it up just to spite the village? Dad already emailed Sarah back asking if she's willing to talk over the phone or even meet in person so we can organize reporting what she told us to the police. She says she knows of countless other crimes that have been committed in the village, from common assaults to much more serious incidents of violation, and if that's true, then we might not even need to prove that they killed Tom in order to get some degree of justice. We're literally just waiting for her to reply, but it's been almost a week since we sent the email and we've heard nothing back from her. I suppose if she does get back to us, I'll write a follow-up just to let everyone know what happened. But if not, then I don't know what I'll do, because it means someone decided to basically torture me using the death of my own brother. And I hate living in a world where people like that might exist. My name's Henry. I'm born and raised up here in the state of Wyoming, and I run a hotel here in Cody, which some consider to be the gateway to Yellowstone. There's nothing I enjoy more than regaling our guests with a tale or two, and over the years, local history became a passionate hobby of mine. Not all of history has been put to paper, and it's a sad fact that some of it never will reach the big screen or even the pages of a book. If you got the time, patience, and know-how, you can learn of some pretty wild things that have happened around the Equality State that not too many people know about. You see, Wyoming wasn't settled in a regular sense, and it's the least populated region in America. meaning there's a whole lot of don't know what out there among the mountains and the forests. It's cowboy country through and through, so there are plenty of stories involving gunslingers and outlaws, but there are also native legends, stories about pioneer fur trappers, and even tales from Oregon Trail wagon trains. Yet while there are many stories that have inspired hope and pride, there are just as many that summon feelings of fear, dread, and disgust. And today I'd like to share a very chilling story from the life of a man named Buster Teague. Back in 1860, the Pony Express was started, and this involved recruiting a team of relay riders who would carry mail almost 2,000 miles from Missouri to California in just 10 days. Here in Wyoming, the route cut through Fort Laramie, Devil's Gate, and Fort Bridger, among others. Light riders pushed hard, day and night, hindered by neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night, to deliver news and letters which kept the country stitched together. And while it only lasted 18 months or so before the telegraph took over, those Pony Express riders became legendary. And James Buster Teague was one of them. Teague was not a light rider. Like Wild Bill Hickok himself, Buster was too heavy for the saddle, and so instead of riding the fast relays between stations, he was given the task of putting letters directly into hands all throughout Wyoming territory. This was a slow process, as mailmen not only needed to be able to be polite, punctual, and professional, but they needed to be skilled frontiersmen too. From bad weather or wild animals to native warriors or bloodthirsty bandits, there was plenty to lay a good man low in those days, and sometimes a man paid the ultimate price for choosing honorable work. Buster Teague was well aware of such dangers, which is why he carried 2 Colt revolvers on him during every ride, and it was in the late summer of 1861 that Teague encountered something truly terrifying. At the break of dawn, Buster could ease his mail pouch onto his horse and then head out on a shift that included about 75 to 100 miles of hard riding. He'd cover around 10 miles an hour if the trail was decent, usually at a fast trot or lope, but even in the 1860s, Wyoming was as wild gets. Buster rode through a vast sagebrush flats that stretched for miles, and then he'd hit rivers with bottoms so muddy his horse got stuck. Sometimes the waters were deep and swift enough to dismount and drown him should he not prove skilled enough. But skilled he was. As Buster noted in the journals he kept, life could get really lonely out there in the wilds, but he knew delivering mail was important. You gotta remember that this took place right at the start of the American Civil War, so at a time when people didn't know if they were going to have a country next year, keeping people in the loop felt like a very important job. Teague would pull up to some remote station or settlement, hand off the mochila, a Spanish word meaning satchel or backpack, and then after a quick bite to eat and a cup of coffee, he'd be on the move to the next stop. He had to move quick to stay on schedule, as there was a lot out there to slow him down. And like I said, many a good mail carrier lost their lives at that time, and the same thing almost happened to Teague one day when he was out riding the trails. So one day, Buster's riding along a lonely stretch of Sweetwater, minding his own with that mochila full of mail, when out of nowhere, the Cheyenne Brave comes bursting from the rocks in an ambush. He cried out his war whoop, and then after aiming his rifle, he let loose a shot that ripped through Buster's leg. Buster's own pistol shots kept the Brave at bay, but having dropped his now empty rifle, the Brave produced a tomahawk and began charging from the rocks. Teague took off down the trail, clinging to the saddle while his leg burned like there was fire in it, but all he could do was clench his teeth, spur his pony on, and hope that he made it someplace safe. A few miles down the trail, Buster slid off his horse, half falling because his leg was giving out on him, and then he hunkered down in the dirt to patch himself up. He rips a strip off his shirt, ties a tourniquet, and then digs out as much of that bullet as he can with his knife. He had to grit his teeth so hard they almost cracked, but he got the job done. Then after he's all bandaged up and ready to move, he takes a minute to catch his breath and survey the scene around him. And that's when Buster spots a patch of dirt nearby that looked like it's been disturbed. He found his feet and then limped over to check it out, but when he looked inside, he just about recoiled in horror. It was a shallow pit, and inside were a whole bunch of human bones. Now, Buster could tell right away that they were human and wrote in his diary that he counted at least a dozen flesh-stripped skulls, but it was the longer bones that really caught his attention. They'd been picked clean, with all signs pointing towards the fact that someone had cut away the flesh and then cracked open the bone to extract the precious protein-rich mush inside, or in other words, all signs pointed to cannibalism. Buster had heard rumors about it for years, how certain bands resorted to cannibalism in hard times, or for the sake of dark rituals. But he'd always figured that those were nothing but tall tales told by trappers trying to scare folks off their patches. But then there it was, the not-so-living proof that rumors were true. Yet regardless of who those bones once belonged to and how they got there, Buster had to keep moving. He patched himself up as best he could, got back on that horse somehow, then pushed on into the wilds in the hopes of finding shelter for the night. But as the setting sun had started to paint the hills with bloody reds and oranges, and the shadows of tree trunks either side of the trail were starting to reach for him, Buster started to become afraid. He knew that should he try and camp out under the stars, he'd be easy prey for a pack of wolves. And so on and on he went, hoping beyond hope that he'd find somewhere safer. And then suddenly, as if by a miracle, he began to smell wood smoke. Buster slowly pushed on, trying to hone in on the source of the smoke, and then he spotted it. A secluded little cabin tucked back in a draw, half hidden by cottonwoods and a rocky outcrop. He spotted smoke curling out of the chimney, and then as he got closer, he smelled food being prepared inside. So not wanting to spook the occupants, Teague called out to announce himself, and that he meant them no harm. Seconds later, a young woman of maybe 20 steps out into the porch. Pretty in a frontier kind of way, with her hair tied back and wearing a simple dress, she seemed alarmed at first, but then took one look at Teague's wounded leg and waved him inside. Buster later wrote that he near fell from his horse with relief and then almost collapsed from the pain of climbing off his horse after balancing his weight wrong. The young woman was apparently a lot stronger than she looked, and she helped bear his weight as she helped Teague into the snug interior of her cabin. The floor was swept clean. There was a stone fireplace crackling away, and a table with some bread and dried meat. There were herbs hanging above a big old pot, which bubbled away from being set over that fireplace. The girl said her name was Annie Mae, and then her husband was out hunting and that she'd fix him a bowl of venison stew should he require refreshment. Teague gratefully accepted her offer, and then after she sat him down with a bowl and a hunk of bread, Annie Mae went about cutting away his pant leg and properly cleaning his wound. Teague said they talked a while as she worked, and she explained that they'd been living a quiet life out there, away from folks. He told her he was a mail rider who almost got bushwhacked on the trail, but he didn't mention the bone pit on account of not wanting to scare the girl. The girl nodded, like violence was nothing new out there, and then before long, the door swung open and in walked her husband. Teague wrote that he was a tall fella named George, bearded and carrying a rifle. He looked Buster over with his narrow eyes for a moment, and then once Annie Mae explained what had happened, he smiled and told Teague he was welcome to stay as long as he needed. Now it all seemed kind enough, but Teague wrote in his journal that something about the way the man looked at him seemed off, like he was sizing him up for something, not just looking at him. A couple of hours later, and after giving Teague a blanket and a spot on a straw tick in the corner, the trio settled down to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Even with the few gulps of whiskey George gave him, Teague's leg hurt something fierce, and every time he managed to drift off, some subtle movement would send pain shooting through his leg. His mind started fixating on that pit full of bones, whether or not George knew that they were there, or if they had some arrangement with the local Cheyenne whereby they paid tribute to live there. He lay there wondering and planning his next move until dawn broke, and then as the sky turned this shade of pale blue, Annie Mae brewed a pot of coffee while George went out to chop firewood. Having been told that he could help himself to another cup of coffee and not wanting to interrupt his host's work, Buster Teague tried hopping over to the stove himself. It was a dumb move, because about halfway there he loses his balance and knocks a chair over on the way down. The chair hits a panel beneath a sink and closet unit, causing the panel to come loose. Then, in his guilt, he crawled over to it in order to inspect the damage he'd done. Teague later wrote that the panel seemed to have come away easy, but it was only on closer inspection that he realized its flimsy attachment was by design, and that the panel concealed a secret storage space. This didn't alarm him, as a young couple like that most likely needed a place to hide valuables from folk who wished to rob them. But while trying to put the panel back into place, Teague caught a glimpse of what was inside, and when he did, his blood ran cold. Because inside that little cubbyhole were a pair of buckskin leggings, a war shirt with beadwork, and some moccasins. The same clothes worn by the Cheyenne brave that had attacked him on the trail. Teague wrote that things didn't make sense for him at first, and he assumed George had killed the Cheyenne warrior following his own encounter with him. But on the point of when the killing took place, Teague's train of thought started to collapse in on itself. Why hadn't George said anything? Why sneak the clothes in there in the middle of the night? Teague said he'd noticed George fiddling with something under the sink that night, but hadn't assumed anything strange. But why wait until he was asleep to stow it away in there? And that's when everything made sense, I guess. And he realized that it wasn't some hostile that had attacked him, but rather George, the man whose hospitality he'd enjoyed for a night. The pit of scrapped bones would explain the abundance of meat the couple enjoyed, and in a place where hunting meant clashing with the Cheyenne. It wasn't venison that was in that stew. It was human flesh. Teague wrote that in the moment, he couldn't be entirely certain of his suspicions. He had a set of clothes, not a confession, and had not witnessed the couple's supply of meat being carved from a human cadaver. Yet as a yell of concern from George broke the silence, Teague realized that revealing his discovery provoked immeasurable risk, and made the decision not to disclose it. He pulled the chair away from the wash basin as George walked through the door, and then held firm as poker face until he was in the clear. Now he knew that to depart right then may well mean certain death. If Teague's suspicions were correct, George and Annie Mae had no doubt made plans to add him to their stew pot. He realized that they'd been hoping that he'd die of his injuries, which saved them from the trouble of cutting his throat during the night and making a mess of their nice straw tick. But on the other hand, if he didn't pass on, they could always fatten him up a little using the salted, preserved remains of their previous victims, and then put him into the slaughter once he was healthy and chubby enough to move on. If that was the case, Teague needed to plan his next moves very carefully, and so that's what he did. He played dumb, kept on playing the grateful victim, and began planning his escape. The next morning, after another sleepless night, Teague announced his departure to George and Annie Mae. The sleepless night had been for two reasons. Firstly, Teague had been busy putting his escape plan into action, but secondly, his escape required him to gather his strength, and gathering his strength meant gulping down a lot of what was bubbling away in the couple's stew pot. He wrote that while he told himself it was nothing but venison, what he saw lying in that bone pit had him forcing down every gulp. Teague's poker face was pushed to the absolute limit, as reacting poorly to their fare might cause George and Annie to become suspicious. But once again it held firm, and they retired to their small bedroom once darkness had fallen, only to emerge in the morning to Teague's news of his departure. In his journal, Teague describes how George and Annie Mae exchanged a quick look of apprehension. The former smiled at him and proposed he stay another night to let his leg heal a little more, but Teague insisted. He said folks would start to worry about him if he stayed missing much longer, and he didn't want to be responsible for some poor kid getting scalped and shot full of arrows on his account. Teague said the air grew thick, but with his pistols on him and caught unprepared, George and Annie had little choice but to accept his departure and let him pass. Having already gathered his things, Teague headed out to saddle up his horse, and as he did, he heard the cabin door open and close again behind, and George and Annie Mae stepped out onto the porch. He felt their eyes burning into his back as he tightened the cinches, and while every move made his leg burn, he refused George's offer of assistance. Teague put one foot in the stirrup, swinging up low while holding back yelps of pain, and then as he plunked himself down in the saddle, that's when George raised the shotgun he left with Annie Mae for defense and pointed it right at Buster Teague. Buster said George had the decency to apologize before he announced he wasn't letting him leave, and then without another word, he took a more careful aim at his target and then pulled the trigger. Yet instead of a bang and a spray of shot, George's pull of the trigger yielded nothing but a dull click. He tried again with the second barrel, but his effort yielded the same surprising result. And then just as a panicked George broke open his gun to check if it was loaded, Buster Teague pulled 2 shotgun shells from his coat pocket, both of which he'd removed from the shotgun that previous night. His journal states that he asked them, "Looking for these?" which in my mind must have made for quite a moment. But before George could turn and rush into the cabin for his pistol or more shells, Buster Teague shot him down like a dog. The shot caught him square in the chest, knocking him back into the doorframe before he crumpled and gasped, with blood spreading on his shirt. Annie Mae's face twisted up with rage, and she let out a scream that barely sounded human, and that Teague wrote sounded more like a banshee straight from hell. He said her face changed, all twisted up with fury and madness, then she came flying off the porch at him with a knife that she took from someplace. She was screaming curses, transforming into something feral and demonic right before Teague's very eyes. Not literally a demon, mind you, but the way she moved, just a ball of wild evil and hatred, it scared him as bad as any peril previously faced. The woman's screams spooked Buster's horse, but he held firm, aimed his pistol, and fired another shot in her direction. He said she kept coming, that the first shot did nothing but knock her down for a moment. Then she was on him, clawing at his leg and trying to tear open the wound. Teague recocked his pistol, then fired again. Only that time, the barrel was just about touching the woman's forehead, and there was no getting up from that one, let me tell you. But even after she fell, Teague wrote that she still glared up at him as she lay there twitching, her eyes full of something unholy. Teague didn't stick around to make sure they were dead. He kicked his horse into a gallop, and pain be damned, he rode hard away from that cursed cabin and the monsters who called it home. He wrote that blood began seeping through the bandage Annie Mae had torn up, but he didn't slow until he was back on the trail and well on his way towards the pony station he was expected at. When he arrived, Teague slid off his horse and landed on the ground with a painful thud. The station keeper ran out to help him, then once he was inside, and after a few gulps of good whiskey, Buster told the station keep where he'd been, what he'd seen, and what had happened to him. After listening to the story of how he'd been ambushed, found help, and then had to shoot his way out when they turned on him, the station keep ordered his assistant to go grab a doctor stationed about 30 miles away. Now, he wouldn't be there until the next morning, but Teague wasn't going anywhere. 2 sleepless nights had left him exhausted and in dire need of rest, and so the next time he opened his eyes, the doctor was standing over him, ready to inspect his wound. Following some good treatment and a few days' rest, Buster Teague got back on his horse and then headed back to Fort Laramie. He was hauling a fresh mochila within a month, and apparently he wanted nothing more to get back in the saddle and rid himself of the boredom he felt at the fort. But even by his own admission, Buster Teague was never quite the same after the encounter with George and Annie Mae, if indeed those were their real names. He found he didn't trust as easy as he once had, and that he always watched the shadows a little closer as they started to fall. He said he had no regrets traveling to Wyoming for work, but knew plainly that the wilds of Wyoming held secrets worse than any outlaw killers or scalp-hungry war party. For there were cannibals out there, monsters hiding behind friendly faces who lived on the flesh of the lonely and the lost. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, congratulations to the Swifts. Hey man, I love the channel, but I'm gonna have to apologize in advance for how vague I'm gonna be here because this whole thing already caused a ton of crap for my family and I. I'm talking the kind of crap I wouldn't even wish on my worst enemy. And since I can't have it happening again, I'm gonna try and stay as faceless as possible here. So I was born into a family that had been very lucky when it comes to finances. We've had a bunch of money in the family going back generations, but for the longest time, all I knew was that it came from a forefather being a successful merchant back in covered wagon times. History wasn't my thing growing up, and my family didn't talk about it much either, so I didn't really know squat about it until just after I turned 16. And it all started on a Sunday morning. On my birthday, Dad told me that I could get a learner's permit and he'd buy me a car if I kept my grades up at school. And so I'm still walking on air as I pass Mom on the way to do her little grocery run. She made a joke about how I'd be driving her soon, and I was just like the Cartman in that South Park episode when he's lying on a pile of money just saying, "Yeah," with his big dumb smile on his face. I don't know if you remember that one, but after she left, I walked into the kitchen to make myself some breakfast. And then a minute later, all I heard was her honking her horn, and not just like a quick beep. It was like those long, prolonged, solid blasts. So me, my dad, and my two brothers went running out the door and down the driveway to see what had happened. And at first, I remember being terrified that some kind of freak car accident had killed her. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when I saw that she and her car were fine, but she was standing on the road with the door open, pointing at the wall outside of our house, and with her jaw practically grazing the ground. Because spray painted on the side, and in massive dark red letters, someone had written, "Blood Money Pigs are gonna pay." It was kind of scary at first because, while Blood Money Pigs is a cool name for an industrial metal band, it is not what you want to see spray painted on the wall of your house. But then once we thought about it, we figured it was probably some jealous a-hole wanting to vandalize a nice neighborhood, and we just so happened to be the unlucky house that they chose to dirty up, so to speak. Yet while he wouldn't share anything with us until much later, it wasn't long before my dad started to suspect their choice of target wasn't so random. And that's because after washing and repainting the wall so it looked good as new, the exact same thing happened maybe 2 to 3 weeks later. Sunday morning, Mom goes on her little grocery run, then brrr, something else had been spray painted on the wall. "Blood on your hands," it said. Now, it was clear we were being targeted for some reason because no one else in the neighborhood ever reported any vandalism, but all we could really focus on at the time was why us. Mom was a homemaker and pretty popular with the other moms at school and around the neighborhood too, so it wasn't like she had any serious enemies. And then Dad spent his time running a charitable foundation that, long story short, was financed by the money his investment group made. He worked with sick kids, animal shelters, the homeless, you name it, anyone who needed the help in, let's just say, the general vicinity, Dad could be counted on to show up with an oversized check for a handshake and a photo. Naturally, he too was a very popular man. So how in the name of all hell did we have blood on our hands? Mom and Dad ended up getting involved, and Dad paid to have some fancy security camera attached to the front gate. But then whoever was vandalizing the wall must have noticed, because the first thing they did the next time they showed up was spray the camera lens so it couldn't see them writing, "Kelsey Scum Leave Town," on the outside wall of our house. Now, they didn't just graffiti that time either. These vandals poured a bunch of gas or something over the wall and then set fire to the plants at the side of our driveway, most likely in the hopes that the whole place would catch fire and burn down. Like I said, Dad already had his suspicions regarding why we were being targeted, but it wasn't until the Kelsey incident that he had them confirmed. Yet he still kept Mom and us in the dark, and the meaning behind the Kelsey name was lost in the confusion. And by that I mean none of it made sense, so it's not like the name clicked with us like it did with Dad. He started paying for security to watch the street outside our house, which basically involved a pair of dudes taking turns keeping watch 24/7. And it was one of those security guys that chased off someone who was likely trying to follow us to school in the morning to see which ones me and my brothers went to. And that was the going theory, at least. We didn't have it 100% confirmed, but it was still enough to scare Mom and Dad into moving us out of that house for a while, at least until the cops could figure out what was going on. But like I said, Dad kind of knew what was going on. He just didn't tell our mother until we were safely someplace else. My brothers and I find out a whole other story too, but since it's way longer and takes place years after the graffiti stuff, I'll just write this like you're my mom finding out after we moved. So, sometime in the early 1840s, two of my ancestors made the journey from Kentucky to California. Andrew and Benjamin Kelsey bought cattle rights to a stretch of land near Clear Lake from a Mexican guy who worked with the local Pomo Indians to drive his herds. But when the Kelsey brothers took charge, assisted by a man named Charlie Stone, they weren't nearly as friendly with the Indians as the Mexican was. See, they came from Kentucky, which was a slave state, a place where it was very much a work or die type mentality, and while the Pomo wouldn't work for free, Andrew Kelsey paid wages that his own self would have found straight up insulting. Once they were set up, his brother Ben returned to some ranch they had and left Andrew and Charlie Stone to deal with the Pomo, and deal with them they did. One day, a disagreement between Charlie Stone and a Pomo warrior almost turned violent. Andrew Kelsey managed to defuse the situation and promised the Pomo better treatment, but just before dawn the next morning, he and Charlie rode around with their rifles, confiscating all the Pomo's weaponry at gunpoint. And after that, since the Pomo had no viable means of defending themselves, the two men ramped the mistreatment up to 11 and started cussing out or horsewhipping the Pomo whenever they were working too slow or did something wrong. And this went as well as you might imagine, and ended with the Pomo laying siege to the house Kelsey and Stone had built, which was apparently more like a fortress by that point, as they had an idea that the Pomo might rise up. Which is like a whole other level of a-hole, right? Now anyway, it's all going to hell down at Clear Lake, and somehow news of this got to Andrew's brother Ben, who showed up with a posse to chase the Pomo off. And while Ben was definitely exploiting his own band of Pomo back on his own ranch, he wasn't nearly as much of an a-hole as his brother, not at first anyway. To defuse the situation, he promised the Pomo generous pay if they'd hunt down a band of native cattle rustlers who had been bothering him. Turns out these rustlers had been bothering the Pomo too, so not only were they too happy to hunt them down, but they dropped their dispute with Andrew after getting a big pile of cash from Benjamin. And before he left, Benjamin also warned his brother to start treating the Pomo better, or they'd do the same thing and rise up all over again. You think he might have taken his older brother's advice, but Andrew's dumbass went right back to the same old routine and treated those Indians like crap again. With the help of a bunch of ranch hands he hired, Kelsey took the Pomo's weapons away again. But that time, he also took away their fishing gear too, meaning they were entirely reliant on him for all their food and other essentials, and he gave them next to nothing. This went on for a while, and then when a young Pomo boy asked for another cup of wheat to feed a sick mom, Charlie Stone shot him dead on the spot to make an example of him to the others. Having gotten word of how the same pattern of mistreatment was playing out again, Ben Kelsey rode over to his brother's land and hired 50 Pomo men to take part in a gold mining expedition. But after Ben got sick with malaria, the Pomo stayed put and ended up getting picked off one by a combination of malaria and hostile tribes. Ben didn't mean any of them to die, but when word reached their families, they became incredibly angry. And then after a Pomo girl went missing for a few days, they turned up again saying that Andrew had been keeping her prisoner and using her as a love slave, and the crap well and truly, at that point, hit the fan. A Pomo chief snuck into Andrew's gunpowder store before dawn one morning and poured water all over it to make it unusable. And then once the sun came up, a band of warriors attacked Andrew's house with bows and arrows that they'd been making in secret. They took him by complete surprise and had him shot full of arrows before he even had time to react. Charlie Stone ended up shooting down a couple of warriors, and then he tried escaping by jumping out of a window but hurt himself on landing. He tried running, but he obviously couldn't. Then, after easily running him down, and this is according to my dad, the Pomo warriors bashed his head in with a rock as a way of saying that he was too low and dishonorable to be killed with regular weapons. A few weeks later, when Ben Kelsey heard about what happened, he rode down to Andrew's place with a hired posse to recover his body. And that's when the massacre really started, because as they went, they killed every single Pomo Indian they could find. Ben and his boys killed so many of them that on account of all the public outrage, they ended up getting arrested when they returned home. Dad said the case was the first ever to reach the California Supreme Court, but in the end, none of the men were ever tried for anything, and when the army refused to help him drive the Pomo out, Ben Kelsey threatened to take an even bigger posse out there to finish them off himself. In the end, the army sent out a bunch of cavalry to move the Pomo on, but their commander was very sympathetic to Ben's story and had no intention of peacefully moving anybody off the land. When he and his men found the Pomo camp, they found it defenseless, as mostly all of the younger warriors were off on a big deer hunt someplace. They left only 400 Pomo, mostly women, kids, and old people, and the army killed around half of them. The army also killed just less than 100 more Pomo as they rode back to base camp, and while Ben Kelsey didn't directly take part in this, the greater part of the massacre, it can't be said that he didn't have a hand in it. Dad said that the way it was told to him when he was a kid, Ben Kelsey was basically cursed after that. He ended up selling his land in California, then moved the family to Mexico for some time, and then on to Texas, and it was there that, in a weird twist of vengeance, one of his daughters barely survived being violated and scalped by a Comanche warrior when their wagon was attacked. The ordeal scarred her mentally for life, and she was basically kept in the house all the time with no one allowed to see her because the sight of any strange person would send her into wild fits of screaming and crying. And to get away from the place that almost took his daughters from him, Ben moved the whole family back to California, where he got into the mining business. He then spent his twilight years in Los Angeles before dying in his 70s in the 1880s. Benjamin Kelsey had made a ton of money by the time he died, and it was all shared out among his surviving kids, one of whom ended up being my grandpa's grandpa. He invested it wisely, the fortune kept on going, then by the time it was all handed off to my dad, he could afford to create the foundation and basically pay a bunch of people to manage all of his stocks and whatnot for him while still making stupid amounts of money. No, I'm not gloating, I'm just being real, and while I am proud of my dad for being sensible and not blowing the fortune, which does happen a lot, I guess all that money really can be traced back to a single source, which was the Kelsey brother mistreating and massacring the Pomo while making a ton of money in the process. I guess someone figured that out and then traced the family line down right to my dad before deciding that they were going to try and get some late-in-the-game revenge on behalf of the natives. And while I don't condone what they did, I can definitely understand why they were so mad when they read about the massacre, because I sure as hell was too. And as you can probably tell, I've done a lot of research on what the Kelseys did, and I've read a bunch of other books on the wider subject of U.S. Native relations. They vary wildly depending on where you're looking and when, and it's not always so black and white as people on Twitter want you to believe. But in the case of what they call the Bloody Island Massacre, it's clear to me that there were a bunch of Indians living relatively peaceful lives someplace, and then when these 3 American guys showed up, it signaled the doom of hundreds of innocent Native people. And that's just depressing and enraging and shameful in a way that I don't think I can put into words. It's obviously not mine or my dad's fault for what happened in the past, so I don't think we deserve to be targeted for what some guy did almost 200 years ago. But at the same time, I know for certain which charity I'm going to send a bunch of my inheritance to on the day it arrives. And that's the Lucy Moore Foundation, a non-profit organization founded to educate the public about what my ancestors did. It's named after a survivor of the massacre, a 6-year-old girl who hid underwater in the lake and breathed through some kind of hollow reed so she didn't have to come up for air. And sometimes, I think I'd swap all that money that we got in our family just so she wouldn't have to go through what she did. My name is Marie. I'm from France, and a few years ago, I decided to do some research on my family tree. To be specific, I wanted to know what my ancestors were doing around the time of the French Revolution, and my sister agreed it would be cool to know their story from that time, but strangely, our mother didn't seem nearly as enthusiastic. She kept asking things like, "Why do you care? It was such a long time ago," or "Why are you wasting time on the past when you should be looking for a husband?" In a sense, I understood where she was coming from. I was single at the time, and my mother has always been very vocal about her desire for grandchildren. But I now know her questions were coming from a very different and much darker place in her mind. Tracing my great-grandparents was easy, but from there, things got more and more difficult until I hit a dead end. The earliest relative I could find was a woman named Marie-Louise Pauline Blanc, who died in 1850, yet for some reason I couldn't find any records detailing the location or date of her birth. She had a few brothers and sisters, including Louise Marie, who died in Paris in 1881. Yet once again, there was no information on where or when she was born, only that the first records of her existence in France began in 1834 when she was already a grown woman. Record-keeping from the time is notoriously unreliable or frustratingly incomplete, so at the time, I didn't find anything overly unusual about the absence of information. But then I discovered Marie-Louise and Louise Marie, who I suspected of having a very uncreative mother, had another sibling, a brother named Jean-Pierre Pauline Blanc, who helped me figure out why there was no record of my family in France prior to the 1830s. Because Jean-Pierre hadn't died in France like his sisters. He'd died across the Atlantic, in the storied city of New Orleans. I had no idea my ancestors were colonists, or that at least one of our family had made their way across the ocean to the New World. My sister was excited by the news and bid me to keep up my research. I believed our mother would react with the same kind of indifference, asking why I was bothering to dig up the past when it had no bearing on our present. But to my surprise, when I mentioned that one of our ancestors made his home in the Americas, she acted like I had spoken of raising the dead. She begged me to stop what I was doing and not to dig any further because pain and suffering was all it would bring. And it was then, and only then, that I realized that she knew a lot more than she was telling me. I gave her an ultimatum. Either she told me what she knew about our ancestors, or I'd keep on researching and find out for myself. And then after inviting me over to the house, this is what she told me. Our ancestors had migrated to New Orleans, but had done so via Ireland at the behest of Louis Barthélemy de Macarty. It's unclear how the Frenchman earned his Irish second name. And there, he and his wife had a daughter they named Marie Delphine, who was born March 19th in 1787. Marie Delphine was just 4 years old when the Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791. Enslaved Haitians cast off the shackles of servitude, and the revolution peaked with the massacre of thousands of French colonists and slave owners whom their former slaves referred to as barbarians. Before the massacre of the French, the colonists punished enslaved rebels by binding them together, loading them onto ships, and then tossing them into the Caribbean Sea to drown. A French general also pioneered a primitive form of a gas chamber, locking hundreds of black prisoners in the holds of these ships and burning sulfur to asphyxiate them en masse. But that's not all. The French imported specialized Cuban bloodhounds trained to track, maul, and eat enslaved Haitians, sometimes holding public spectacles in amphitheaters where prisoners were bound to stakes and torn apart by these dogs for the entertainment of French officers. Yet most offensive to the enslaved were the public crucifixions that captured rebels were subjected to. Seeing their fellow rebels hanging from crosses, burned alive, or broken on Catherine wheels inspired the massacre that would follow. And as stories of the violence made their way to New Orleans, terrified slave owners either improved their slaves' living conditions dramatically or subjected them to even harsher treatments in the hopes that it would break their spirits and reduce the chances of their revolt. In fact, Marie Delphine's uncle had been murdered by his own slaves in 1771, and as a family of slave owners, their solution was to treat their slaves as animals. In June of 1808, a then 21-year-old Marie Delphine married a man named Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. At the time of the marriage, Blanc purchased a house at 409 Royal Street for the family, which became known later as the Villa Blanc. Delphine had 4 children by Blanc, one of which was our direct ancestor. But the marriage did not survive, and in June of 1825, it seems Marie had a thing for June weddings. She married her third and final husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicolas Lalaurie, after which she went by the name that she would take to her grave and the one by which she is infamous, Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie. In 1831, Madame Delphine had a 2-story mansion constructed at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name and with little involvement of her husband following their eventual separation. She lived there with her children, but the household was maintained by black slaves, and in line with her own family's treatment of their slaves, they were treated abominably. I found mention of Madame Delphine in a book by Harriet Martineau, an Englishwoman who wrote books about sociology, and she mentions that even in a place where black slaves were treated as less than animals, Madame Delphine's slaves were, and I quote, singularly haggard and wretched. This stands in stark contrast with Madame Delphine's public treatment of black people, both free and enslaved, as Martineau noted that she was generally polite to them and seemed to care a great deal about their physical health. Yet official records tell a very different story. Between 1830 and 1834, local funeral registers show that 12 of Madame Delphine's slaves passed away, but the cause of their deaths are not listed. These include a cook named Bonne, listed as a chronic runaway, along with her 4 children. Their deaths caused such an uproar in New Orleans that rumors of grave mistreatment circulated and eventually prompted a visit from a local lawyer who intended to remind Lalaurie of the laws for the upkeep of enslaved people. Yet this lawyer found no evidence to suggest wrongdoing or mistreatment of enslaved peoples by Lalaurie, and the report of his findings seemed to have adequately quelled the rumors, at least for a while anyway. Author Harriet Martineau was still present in New Orleans when one of Madame Lalaurie's slave girls fell from the roof of the Royal Street mansion. An eyewitness said that the 8-year-old girl was attempting to escape punishment and was being pursued at the time by a whip-wielding Madame Lalaurie. It was later discovered that the young girl's name was Leah, and that she'd been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, angering Lalaurie to the point that she grabbed a whip and started chasing her. The incident led to another investigation whereby Madame Lalaurie was found guilty of illegal cruelties and forced to give up 9 of her slaves. Yet through some horrible twist of fate, these slaves were then brought back by the Lalauries through an intermediary relative and thus returned to the mansion. One such slave, the cook who replaced the deceased Bonne, was chained to the stove and had her children beaten mercilessly whenever she failed to live up to Madame Lalaurie's standards. The situation reached breaking point in April of 1834 when a fire broke out at Lalaurie's mansion. It was later discovered this fire was started by the cook, a 70-year-old woman who was chained to that stove by her ankle and who said she herself had deliberately started the fire rather than face yet another punishment of watching her children being beaten. This cook also claimed that any slaves were taken to the uppermost room, never to come back. Bystanders who witnessed the fire attempted to enter the mansion to ensure everyone had been evacuated, yet it was reported that Madame Lalaurie refused to hand over the keys. In response, these bystanders broke down the mansion's doors, and it was then, while going from room to room and looking for survivors, that they discovered all manners of horror. 7 of the slaves were found hanging by their arms, legs, or necks, with one witness saying their limbs were stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. Another witness was a local judge named Jean-François Canonge, who claimed to have seen a black woman forced to wear an iron collar, as well as an older slave woman with a head wound so dire that she could not stand properly. Canonge said that when he questioned Lalaurie's husband about those enslaved on the property, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. When word of Monsieur Lalaurie's most unrighteous indignation spread, a mob of local citizens attacked the Royal Street mansion and, according to one bystander, destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. The local sheriff and his officers were called to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. Madame Lalaurie's surviving slaves were taken to a local jail, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because the judge wanted people to see them, so they'd know how they'd been treated and know the evil that Madame Lalaurie had done. The grounds of the mansion were also dug up, and the bodies of several slaves were said to have been exhumed, including that of little Leah, who fell from the roof. People were furious with the Lalaurie family and wanted her hanged, but by that point she had already fled New Orleans for France. The mansion was later rebuilt, and through my own research, I discovered that actor Nicolas Cage had bought the house for a sum of $3.45 million in April of 2007, but the documents were arranged in such a way that Cage's name did not appear on them, and he later sold the property, so he's no longer the owner. Madame Lalaurie lived out the rest of her life in exile in Paris, but missed New Orleans terribly. She actually planned to travel back at one point, but her children convinced her not to, quite rightly saying that she'd probably be killed. Her eventual death in 1849 remains something of a mystery, with some saying that she died in a boar hunting accident, others of natural causes. But what's clear is that even in Paris, she was hated by all who knew what she'd done, and I can count myself among that number. It was very hard for my mother to reveal who our ancestors were. She didn't want me to be burdened with it like she had, but I'm glad she told me. I'm glad I know where I came from, because it's a reminder to be different, and God willing, if I have my own children, I'll raise them to appreciate the value of human life in a way that Madame Lalaurie never did. Growing up, I never knew my paternal grandparents. I was told they died before I was born, but that wasn't entirely true. And it wasn't until my early 20s, when I was finally told this story, that I realized that I had an uncle I'd never met, too. My dad told me the story after he found some pot baggies in my room, kind of like a way of saying, you don't want that life. And boy, did he ever make his point. So, my dad was born at the tail end of the Depression, meaning he, my grandparents, and his siblings grew up in extreme poverty. They ranged in age pretty wildly too, because when my grandpa was still in diapers, his eldest brother was like 18 or 19, that sort of age. And they were so poor that Dad and his siblings sometimes went to bed without any dinner, and when they did eat, it was all Depression-era meals like hard times soup or poor man's pie. Dad said he didn't even get a pair of shoes until he was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and then my grandma and eldest aunt actually shared a pair so my aunt could walk to school and back. It was that kind of hard for them. Not just poor, but dirt poor, you know? And then one day, everything changed. From my dad's perspective, all he noticed was how his ma and pa got real happy all of a sudden, and how the family moved to a much nicer place not longer after they suddenly got happy. They ended up moving to an even bigger place a short while after some big funeral, one that everyone in the county went to, and from then on, things were never the same. Grandma and Grandpa started fighting all the time, then Grandpa and my mysterious uncle got into a big fight too, apparently. And the next morning, Grandpa was gone. Just left a note on the table saying he was sorry along with a whole bunch of money. He was never seen again. No one knew if he lived or died or what happened to him. My uncle, the one I never met, had left some time after, but maybe a year later, Grandma got word that he'd been killed in a bar fight out of state. And that's how my dad grew up. His own dad, gone by the age of 10, to be raised by a single mom who worked herself into an early grave, making sure her kids wanted for nothing. But before she died, she told him the story of what happened to them, why their lives were suddenly transformed for the better one day and then suddenly destroyed out of nowhere. So one day, back when Dad was around 6, Grandpa came home in a totally different mood than he normally would. He usually came home tired and cranky after a long day of either working or looking for work, but on this occasion, my grandma said that he walked through the door with a spring in his step. He picked her up, spun her around, and told her that in 1 week's time, all their money troubles would be over. When she asked how that could be, Grandpa drew a finger to his lips and said, while he couldn't tell her, his word was his bond. Now, sure enough, 1 week later, Grandpa came home with a bundle of cash after being out all night with my uncle, and so began the good life for my dad and his family. But something happened around that time that didn't pass Grandma by, and she took to wondering just how exactly Grandpa had laid his hands on all that cash. You see, the same morning Dad came home with his money, a local farmer was found murdered outside his home. There was a big hoolah about it, and this farmer was a holdout, refusing to sell to this big land baron who wanted to turn his fields into a grazing space. He was offered larger and larger amounts to vacate his land, but he refused every time. All he wanted was to farm his land just like his pa did before him, and then hand it all off to his son once he was reunited with the Lord. That old land baron vowed to get the farmer's land by hook or by crook, so when he was found stabbed to death in the early morning, folks were obviously outraged, and they suspected the baron. Nothing came of it. All the baron's boys had alibis and what have you, so the sheriff suspected outside involvement, like a man for hire. Grandma was so worried that she actually confronted Grandpa about the money and demanded he finally tell her where he got it from. She's always assumed it was from running moonshine since that was still a big thing at the time, but after the farmer's murder, she got to wondering and worrying, enough to ask him to his face, but Grandpa swore he had no part of it. He swore on the Bible that he'd made that money moonshining and that never in his wildest dreams would he kill another man, and a good man at that, for nothing but a pile of blood money. Grandma said she was reassured, but she still never fully lost her suspicions. The timing was too right, and the pile of money seemed way too big for just a single moonshine run. But since he made his case well enough, she didn't question it out loud again. Not until a couple of months later when the farmer's son showed up dead. It looked like nothing more than a terrible accident. The farmer's boy was riding on his horse one night when something like a rattlesnake gave him a scare. The horse bucked him, he fell off, then broke his neck. Simple as that. A lot of people bought it and said how sometimes it's a case of bad things happening to good people, But not everyone saw it for what it was, and as far as I'm concerned, they were right not to. Because the morning after the farmer's boy fell from his horse and broke his neck, my grandpa came home with yet another pile of money. The farmer's boy had actually been set to sell his parcel of land off to the Baron, and at a very fair price too from what Grandma heard. But then right at the last minute, he changed his mind and refused to sell, saying he wanted to honor his dad's wishes. Tradition still means something around here, so everyone celebrated the decision, and that's not even a month or two later, and what do you know? But the farmer's boy has an accident. There was no investigation that time, and since the farmer's widow couldn't handle the day-to-day, she opted to sell it all off to the Baron, only this time at a much, much lower price. There was another big funeral again, and like I said, another big pile of money. But since Grandma had been talking about a moonshine run for weeks in advance, she didn't think much of the timing. Or at least she tried not to think much about it, because the more she did, the more it ate at her. But then over time it got harder and harder not to think about it on account of the way my grandpa and uncle were acting. Part of the reason she was able to forget as much as she did after that first quote-unquote moonshine run was how Grandpa and Uncle acted. They weren't acting like they'd done anything wrong. They were drinking to celebrate, and they were very happy with the family's newfound wealth. But then after the second quote-unquote moonshine run, they were about as opposite as could be. It was like a dark cloud was hanging over each of them. They were surly. They hardly slept at all, and they were either drinking, playing poker, or arguing in hushed voices out on the porch at night. And then one night, after hosting a poker game at the house, the whole situation came to a head. One of the guests made a joke about killing a man over a game of cards, something which my uncle took great offense to. He asked the guest if he knew what it was like to kill a man, and then when the guest said no, scared and confused at my uncle's dark turn, he was told that he should shut his mouth and not joke about such serious things. The situation escalated to the point where my uncle made a not-so-veiled reference to having himself taken a life, and that's when Grandpa exploded. He beat the living hell out of my uncle, right there in front of the poker guests, then dragged him off to the woodshed and locked him inside to sober up. And after that, Grandma confronted her husband for a second time and asked him straight up if he'd gotten all that money from murdering the farmer and son. Grandpa never admitted it, but he broke down in front of her. Then he cried, and he cried, and he cried, for a long, long time, according to Grandma. He was drunk to high heaven, but it wasn't the whiskey that was stopping the words from coming out. Grandpa was just too distraught to speak on whatever was tearing the family apart. She laid him up in bed, tucked him in, then talked him off to sleep. Then Grandma went outside, unlocked the woodshed, and did the same to her boy, who was also in dire need of medical attention too, from what my dad remembered. Now, this meant Grandma didn't get her own self to bed for another couple of hours, and then when she woke up the next morning, sometime after dawn, she noticed my grandpa wasn't lying next to her. She got up to go look for him, and he was gone. And in his place, there was a big pile of money on the table, and a note saying how sorry he was for everything. Grandma pressed my uncle on what he and Grandpa had done, but kept up the lie about moonshining, most probably out of fear for the noose, but also because he was too damn proud to tell the goddamn truth. He ended up running away his own self not long after, but unlike Grandpa, where no one ever heard a word about him and his fate is a total mystery, my uncle ended up dying in a bar fight. Someone caved his head in with a piece of furniture, and I heard they swung for it too. Mom was real sad when they got the news, but she didn't cry at his funeral, not like my dad and his siblings did, because in a sense, her son was dead already. It was just a matter of time before it caught up with him. Grandma ended up moving upstate, where she took a second husband. She died before my dad turned 18, some say of a broken heart, and the man she married stepped up and raised her kids like his own until they were all ready to fly the nest. I never got the chance to meet the man. Heck, I never got a chance to meet my grandma or grandpa, But if I did, I'd shake the man's hand for stepping up and being the father my own grandpa should have been. Because despite all he'd lived through, my dad turned out to be a pretty okay guy, and I miss him very much. So this is kind of an old one, and nothing to do with me really, but I think you'll enjoy it because it's a good one. So I didn't know this until I was like 20-something, but it turns out I'm descended from a man named John Stratton, who was part of the first wave of Americans to come over. Now, it's all total word of mouth, like it isn't even in any history books as far as I know anyway, but the story goes that he arrived with his family in 1610, right around the time the colony was set to be abandoned because everyone was starving. He sailed on a relief ship commanded by a guy called Baron de la Warre, who the state of Delaware is named after, and their arrival was hugely celebrated because it meant the colony could keep going. But my forefather, being a deeply religious man, didn't think much of the colony at all. He sent for his family not long after he'd secured a home for himself, but I guess he was always planning on leaving, because while he was waiting for them to arrive, he went around recruiting a bunch of other like-minded religious types to form a sort of breakaway colony. When his family arrived, John pulled the trigger and announced that he, his family, and several others were headed out into the wilderness to form a village of their own, one that would actually obey God's laws instead of flouting them like they did in Jamestown. I guess I do kind of see things from his perspective too, because Jamestown docks were basically a haven for all kinds of scumbag pirates, not to mention the working girls who served them. So if he was super religious like he was, it figures he got sick of it and decided to leave. Now anyways, so John and the other Puritan families left Jamestown sometime in 1611 and made their way into the woods until they found a clearing that'd make a good space for a small village. They built everything from the ground up, and then within a couple of years, the village was thriving. They'd hauled timber and animal skins back to Jamestown to trade for other goods, but aside from that, they didn't want anything to do with them. They lived by the Bible's laws and used it like a kind of early game constitution, citing its verses whenever they needed a solution to a problem or needed to resolve a conflict. So, time goes by, and something like 10 years after the village was founded, John Stratton was calling himself a minister and was basically the village patriarch who guided his flock in all manners, both earthly and heavenly. But from what I can gather, he had two major problems. The first were the natives, because by 1620, relations had worsened dramatically and it seemed like war between themselves and the settlers was coming no matter what. But the second of John's two problems came in the form of his own flesh and blood. John had around 9 sons and daughters, and they're just the ones who survived. And while the majority of them honored their mother and father, like the Bible told them to, one of them wasn't nearly so unquestionably obedient. And to me, Thomas Stratton sounds a lot like your average teenager these days. He thought the village was boring and lame, and he wanted to go back to Jamestown, and all he had to do was hunt, smoke tobacco, and go walking with his village crush, the girl he wanted to marry. But on the other hand, his dad either wanted him in church or in the fields, and said he was too young and cocky to be a hunter without hurting either himself or someone else. But as you can imagine, this wasn't what young Thomas wanted to hear, and he disobeyed his dad more than once by heading out into the woods and trying to catch deer without permission. John forgave his son for the first time he caught him, but he warned him not to do it again. Then when he did and showed a complete disregard for his dad's wishes, John Stratton decided to make an example of his son. Thomas was still only 14 or 15 at this time, so John had no problem dragging him into the small village square and holding his son down while he dragged down his pants. He then spanked his boy, spanked his bare ass in front of everyone while quoting lines from Proverbs. "Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. And train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is told he will not depart from it." I guess John figured that this would fix his boy and that public humiliation would make him think twice about being disobedient in the future. But as most of y'all can probably guess, it didn't do anything of the sort. Being publicly shamed and spanked made Thomas hate his father. I mean, go figure, right? But he went from some happy-go-lucky rebellious teenager to open defiance, returning the shows of public humiliation on a daily basis by refusing any command that John saw fit to give him. Thomas refused to even hunt when given direction and would wait until his dad asked him to do something else before grabbing his musket and heading off into the woods with the family's hunting dog. And this kept going on for years, with John getting angrier and angrier and despairing over what to do with young Thomas. But by that time, Thomas was basically a grown-ass man, one who could use a musket really well and couldn't be dragged into the town square for a spanking. John waited years hoping his son's rebellious streak would disappear if he just ignored it. But when Thomas finally announced he was leaving the village and was returning not just to Jamestown, but to England, John decided that was not going to happen. The night before Thomas was due to leave for Jamestown, his father gave the impression that he'd accepted it, but was still sad to see him leave. John and Thomas had a little heart-to-heart about how the younger of them needed to make his own way in life, and I'm guessing they must have done the 1600s version of hugging it out, because when Thomas went to bed that night, he didn't suspect a thing. Meanwhile, once Thomas is asleep, his dad goes round and rounds up all the men in the village who were ride or die loyal to him. And then they snuck into Thomas's bedroom, dragged him out of bed, and beat the living crap out of him till he was either out cold or punch drunk enough to drag him off into the woods without him trying to fight. They dragged him out to a spot that John had spent some time the previous day. But while he claimed that he was only going into the woods to talk God, he'd also been mighty busy digging a big old pit that they threw Thomas into when they arrived. John and his buddies then went about burying Thomas up to his chest in soil, and then by the time his senses returned to him, his hands were tied and it was too late to do anything but struggle against the weight of all that soil. Thomas begged his father to let him go, but all John did was quote a verse from Deuteronomy, and the one about what to do with rebellious children. And for the sake of the story, I'll just copy and paste the most relevant parts so you all have an idea of the last things Thomas heard. Bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of a place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of his city, This is our son, stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, so that all the people will hear and fear. After that, when John was done explaining himself to his son, he and his buddies picked up the rocks that they'd piled in a wide circle around the hole. Then they started throwing them at the boy as hard as they could. They smashed the boy's head into a bloody pulp, and they didn't stop until they were absolutely certain he was dead. And then, according to the story, they dug the hole out a little more, laid him in what had always been intended as a grave, then piled the earth on top of him again and walked back to the village. John told everyone that Thomas had left early that morning, and that he'd wished him well on the road back to Jamestown. I don't know exactly how it happened, but the truth got out somehow. My great-aunt Kathy says that she was told that some wild dogs dug Thomas's body up and a hunter found pieces of him all over the woods. But my mom says that she heard it differently, and that John actually confessed to his wife about what he'd done, who reassured him that he'd done the right thing. Either way, John almost completely got away with it, and if it wasn't for one of his other sons who let everyone know what had happened to poor Thomas, I don't think anyone would have ever found out the truth. Things went on as normal for a year or so, and then remember I said about relations between the natives and the settlers breaking down? Well, apparently in 1622 the natives got sick of the tobacco farmers encroaching on their lands, and they went on a major killing spree, burning down whole villages and slaughtering anyone who lived there. And yeah, you guessed it, John Stratton's little religious fiefdom was one of those villages. And if it wasn't for our ancestor escaping with his scalp to Jamestown, I most probably wouldn't be around to write this and keep the story alive of what a piece of human garbage he was for murdering his own son. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations. Look at it anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, play the bagpipes instead. I had this friend back in the 2000s. We were friends since elementary school, all through middle school, and right up until our senior year of high school. I'm pretty sure we still would have been friends now, except she died. I'm sorry to be blunt, but it's still very raw for me. And I'm writing into you both as a cautionary tale and to raise awareness for what I personally believe happened to my friend, who I'm just going to call Sally. Sally and I are kind of stoners in high school. I won't sugarcoat it. We performed well academically, so I guess the teachers and our parents just turned a blind eye. But we smoked a decent amount of pot, and Sally would have really gotten a kick out of it becoming legal just after her death. Thanks, Obama. No, really. Now anyways, one day, Sally came to me very excited. She heard about this new, this is read as very old, drug, and it was like weed but way stronger. And better than that, it was totally and completely legal. She produced the biggest baggie of weed-looking substance I'd ever seen in my life, but it was a darker, spikier bud than what I was used to. Now, it turns out darker is a great description for salvia. Maybe it's not the case that everyone has a similar experience, but everyone I've spoken to has. I smoked a regular joint of salvia, assuming that was the right way, as did Sally. And the high, if you can even call it that, only lasted about 45 minutes. Let's just call it a trip instead. And during that one single experience on salvia, I believed I was God, and then the devil. And at one point I knew I had superpowers, but I dare not use them. I could tell where Sally was sitting, on my couch, but I couldn't see her. She was semi-invisible, kind of like when the Predator cloaks himself in those movies. And it was like the light was refracting around my friend. The posters on my bedroom wall changed into things I can't remember, nor do I even really want to, and I felt both powerless and godlike at the same time. And all this just from lying on my bed and looking up at the ceiling. Some of the stories I've heard or read from people who've taken salvia have been absolutely insane to me. You could do a whole video on terrifying experiences on salvia if only that actually fit your brand, but suddenly I was back to normal. And just like that, I was myself again, and it felt like nothing had happened. Unlike weed, where you feel the aftermath in various ways, the salvia was just sort of gone. Well, at least for me. And when I looked over at Sally, she was just beaming, staring into the middle distance with a blissful look on her face. Now, not to be crude, but it was like she'd just come down from some orgasm. Now, I sort of wondered if she was still tripping. But then she turned to me and I could see it was the same old Sally I knew and loved. And she said something I could never and would never agree with. "That was incredible, dude. I think we found our new drug of choice." Well, there was no way on earth that I was smoking that amount of salvia again. I did try, I really did. Sally was so enthusiastic about it, and something about it being legal made her feel different. As much as she'd been a bit of a pothead, she'd always despised the fact that it was illegal. She'd always hated the fact that we'd had to acquire it from ex-high schoolers who were almost all creeps, and I don't blame her. We both had some bad experiences with dealers from our high school and a bit older, and yeah, I don't really want to talk about those, though. But salvia, you could buy, legally, right from the sources. And there were stores tucked down these small alleys that sold it, and something about this spoke to Sally, I guess. and I guess it helped her have a better experience with the trip. And so, like I said, I tried. I really did. I mixed a tiny bit of salvia in with some rolled up cigarettes. Only I didn't smoke tobacco, so it was like throat effing myself with a lit cigar. I tried mixing it into some brownie mix, and it just tasted like eating brownies with dried leaves in it, and still made me trip in the worst ways. I ground it up and snorted it. Now that was a big mistake. I just sneezed it right out, and that was a gross experience. I don't even want to imagine that one. Now meanwhile, Sally was smoking more and more of what I genuinely believed to be Satan's drug of choice. I had no idea how she was even managing 2, 3, 4 joints of salvia a day without going insane. But I guess that's the problem, isn't it? She was. I just didn't see it. We were in our final year of high school studying for finals and graduation despite what else the salvia might have been doing. It was turning Sally into this sort of savant genius, believe it or not. She went from a B student to an extremely high straight A student in every single one of her classes. The teachers were shocked. If she'd gone through her whole high school career like this, she would have been valedictorian so hard that it would have left the previous one in the dust. As it was, she was on track to comfortably be salutatorian. Now alas, she never made it. It's a tale as old as time, but with a dark modern mystery twist, at least in my opinion it is. Obviously, the drugs got to her, but salvia doesn't get to you in the same way most other drugs do. There are other natural plants that have a lot in common with salvia, but nothing I've ever read about these other drugs have been quite as cursed and haunting as my own experience on that drug, let alone what Sally must have gone through. It started when she came to our shared room in our shared student accommodation one day and announced to me that she'd seen God under a bridge. I assumed she was joking, so I asked if God was under the bridge and if she was so sure it was God and not some homeless troll. Now Sally got kind of, not mad, but serious about this. God hadn't been under the bridge. She'd been under the bridge when she saw God. I asked her to explain how this meant that God themselves wasn't under the bridge, and she told me a story of how, of course, she'd been smoking salvia with some other kids who'd been introduced to the legal substance. And did I emphasize that this crap is legal? By someone, and I'm pretty sure it was Sally, but I didn't want to upset her, and I could hardly accuse her too hard of introducing some kids to some legal plant. Now she explained that God had just appeared inside her head during a short trip, and he told her to cross over in the land of the goddess Sonora. Now at first I didn't understand what Sally was saying. Cross over into where? What? Some kind of spiritual plane? And then it struck me with a dawning horror. She was talking about the Sonoran Desert, but with some kind of spiritual nickname her salvia-induced god had told her. We lived just outside of Phoenix to the southwest, so passing into the Sonoran Desert wasn't at all out of the question. In fact, a bunch of us had taken a camping trip to the outskirts until I realized that getting sand in a certain part of your body is one of the most unpleasant experiences I've had up until that point. I'm sure there are ways that older, seasoned women avoid that in the desert, but I was a 16-year-old high school kid. I had no idea. All I knew was as soon as I got home, I spent so long in the shower that I'm pretty sure my whole abdomen turned into a prune. Now the point is, the potential for sand in her unmentionables aside, I didn't want Sally crossing over into the Sonoran Desert on some salvia-fueled pilgrimage. I protested and insisted that there's absolutely no way Sally should go on a pilgrimage to meet the goddess Sonora, or any other god for that matter. Unfortunately, I could not talk her out of it, no matter how much I rationalized, then begged, cried, screamed, threatened to tell her parents, threatened to handcuff her to her bedpost, all sorts of stuff. And so instead, I made the best compromise I could think of. I offered to go with her, and maybe this story would be very different if she'd said yes. Better or worse, I can't say, but again, she was absolutely adamant that this was something that she had to do alone because God had told her so. She laid out a plan. 1 week from now, she'd head to a certain rock that she'd seen in the vision, whereupon Sonora would be seated and grant her, quote-unquote, the truth, whatever that was. Honestly, the trip didn't seem too bad. If she was careful, she could manage it in a day. I was more concerned when she said the communion with Sonora had to occur at night because the deserts get so cold at night, your nipples feel like they're going to explode, but whatever. She could wrap up warm, and I still had a week to try and talk her out of this madness. Now, I should have seen it coming. When I woke up the next morning, Sally was gone. She'd left a note on her pillow that read, "I'm sorry. God would have wanted it this way." Now, the real sucky thing is that I couldn't drive at the time. I'd never passed my tests, and I had no sensible way of following Sally into the desert. I should have called a friend, but frankly, we'd alienated anyone that I trusted enough with all of this, and I had finals to go study for. Now, I should have made much more of an effort to follow her and catch up with her, even though I'm sure that she left hours before I woke up. Regardless, I will never forgive myself and stop beating myself up for the fact that I could have done more. Sally didn't come home that night. She didn't come home the next day either, or the next. I reported her as a missing person. But despite being in high school, she was 18. She'd left an indication that she'd gone on some vacation, and it was only my word that she'd claimed that she'd be back in a day. I tried to point out that she'd gone out into the desert. I tried to draw on as much research as I'd been able in the days before Google that showed how many people died out there every year. Now, I felt like I was getting through to law enforcement. They promised to send some ranger out to scout out the route that Sally had told me about, and then I made the mistake of mentioning salvia and visions, and saw their eyes glaze over, and at that point I think I lost them. A week passed, and then two, and you'd think that Sally's parents would be frantic at this point too, but here's the thing. Her dad abandoned the family when Sally was 2. Her brother was a 23-year-old stoner who was far more of a hot mess than Sally ever was, and I had no idea how to get a hold of him. And Sally's mom had died when we were in middle school. She really had nobody else, really, and I can kind of see why she wanted to find answers and visions and gods. Eventually, there was a knock on my dorm room door. Sally's car had been found. It appears as if it had been there for a couple of weeks, based on the layer of sand covering it. Now, the rangers and law enforcement were taking it seriously. I insisted that I go with them, that maybe something would jog my memory about the route that she was taking, the rock on which she claimed Sonora would appear. And oh God, I wish I hadn't. And I'm glad I did, but I just wish that I hadn't. I was the one who found her. She was lying in the shade of a 10-foot-high rock, her body half covered in sand by this point, and she was wearing only her underwear, and appeared that she'd neatly folded her clothes beside her before lying down and just slipping away. The official cause of death was exposure to the elements. Sally had somehow, through months of slow salvia-induced psychosis, become convinced that gods were communicating with her. Later, we even found journals in which she claimed Sonora was the goddess of the desert who bestowed power through suffering, thirst, and hunger. And I could never find any actual mythological record of this. It just seemed like something Sally had hallucinated. And so that's a horrible story. It's scary how things can mess with your mind, and maybe my mind's messed up too, but I think things were a lot worse. I don't think Sally actually died of the elements. I think she was murdered. I think somehow someone had been implanting the salvia psychosis into her mind through suggestion. I have no idea who. Someone she got high with when I wasn't around, maybe. And I'll tell you why I think this. Sally wore a locket with 2 photos, one of her mother shortly before she died, and one of the pair of them when Sally was a baby. She never removed that locket. Never. Not when she slept, not when she showered, not when she bathed. She could be completely naked and she'd still be wearing that locket. Not only had she removed it for whatever reason she removed her clothes, but there was no sign of the locket anywhere. It wasn't placed with her clothing like the rest of her belongings, and it wasn't in the car. I told law enforcement about this over and over again, but they insisted that there was no other evidence of foul play. They said the locket could have easily sunk into the sand or all sorts of things. Nobody murdered her, they said, and sure, maybe someone didn't stab or shoot her or crush her trachea, but someone sent her out there to die, and then they took that locket. I'm certain of it. I've been out there so many times searching for it. I've dug, I've searched with metal detectors, and I've once even smoked salvia again against my better judgment, hoping for some type of vision or a map or a culprit or something. I don't know. Maybe Sally had it right. Just lie down and drift away. I'm the one left here still obsessing over this for nearly 20 years, and I don't go out there much anymore, but I can't really leave Phoenix. What if, like the namesake bird, Sally rises from the ashes and shows me who killed her? What if one day I go out there and find the locket? At least I could be at peace. Instead, I'm just sort of left here writing the story, begging people not to go down the salvia path. It's still a legal substance in Arizona, and I don't say this in a sort of winners don't do drugs type of way. It's just the idea of what happened to Sally and what might have happened is enough to terrify me for the rest of my life. I wish I could let go, but I can't. And I hope sending this email to you brings some closure, and thank you for reading. Sally, rest in peace. I've always loved you forever, and you might not have met God, but you're the closest thing to a goddess to me, and I don't need to smoke salvia to know that. So I've been asked to write into you by a younger friend who's a listener. I hope you get a kick out of this one. Apparently you do like bat crap crazy people. Now, a bunch of years ago, after the dawn of cell phones but before the rise of smartphones, me and a bunch of buddies decided to go on a little trip. We've been dreaming of this trip since college, talking about it a bunch and never actually doing it. And so one summer, I was all, guys, F this. We're doing it. We're doing a road trip across the states and nothing can stop us now. Now, we're all from sunny California and all went to the same college there, so it was just a case of seeing the country we so love. And there was no real rhyme or reason to our route. We just plotted out a vaguely cool-looking trail that would take us to all the places that we'd always wanted to visit, or drive through, or pass by with a sort of look of disgust. I won't lie, the four of us were kind of comfortably off. One of us was, and still is, disgustingly rich, but also the most generous pal you'd ever meet. So he offered to fund the majority of the trip, with the rest of us chipping in for food, touristy stuff, roach-infested digs that we might stay in, that kind of thing. But our rich buddy, whose name honestly is Rich, paid for the vehicle, the gas, the upkeep, and he bought a brand new car for the trip, actually. And it was an absolutely stunning Camry, and to say that I was jealous would be an understatement. Now, a slightly buff silver, this thing was a beast. It maybe wasn't the best choice for a road trip. We would have probably been better off getting a van or a camper or something, but we just wanted to drive the American highways looking cool as we did. Now, there were four of us, and the Camry was comfortable, if intimate and crowded, and that was fine with me, given who the group members were. There was Rich, his boyfriend Andy, and then there was me, of course, and finally there was Kay. Now, I've had a huge crush on Kay since the first year of college and never made a move. We just graduated at the start of summer when we went on that road trip, for some context. Now, naturally, while we all took turns driving, the majority of the trip was Rich handling his brand new Camry and Andy riding shotgun. And this meant that I got to spend hours, days really, in the backseat of a car with a girl that I believed was the love of my life. And yeah, okay, it's pretty obvious to anyone on the outside that I've been thoroughly friend-zoned, but bear with me. What is love without hope, and what is hope without being a hopeless romantic loser like myself? This is why my British friends call me a wanker, I guess. No, anyway, it was brilliant. We spent the days driving, sightseeing, and hitting all the tourist traps that sheltered Californian kids typically look down upon. And then we spent the days in a mixture of high-quality hotels, but more often, these flea-ridden desert motels. Now, I couldn't have been happier. It was freaking epic. We passed through a bunch of deserts on our routes. One of our big things, mostly thanks to Andy, who was a geology nerd, was that we wanted to experience as many types of desert as possible, if you understand what I'm saying. A lot of people think deserts are just sand and red dust, but that's not even slightly the case. Did you know most snowfields are technically deserts? Huge areas of just shingles, all sorts of stuff. Now, most salt flats are also deserts, which I think is a more commonly known fact, but it's the Utah Salt Flats, the Great Salt Lake Desert, where this first started. If you've never been, in my opinion anyway, Utah is an absolutely stunning state. The Salt Flats, the Salt Lake Desert, it's a miracle of nature. There's just something about it, something haunting and beautiful about it all. The Bonneville Salt Flats were like a spiritual experience for me, especially experiencing it with Kay. I was growing convinced that I might not be in the friend zone after all. And at one of the motels, there had only been 2 double rooms available. Kay was the one who suggested she and I share, and nothing happened between us, but she wasn't particularly shy in walking out of the shower wrapped in a towel. You know, the kind of thing that makes a naive young man think that she might have a crush when really it's a huge friend zone red flag. But oh well, not the point. Well, it is and does sort of relate, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, we spent maybe too long exploring the deserts of Utah. The sun was beginning to set as we trekked back to the car, ready to head to our next rest stop destination. A few miles down the road, and we spied a car pulled onto the verge. Unpleasant-looking black smoke was billowing out from under the hood, and an extremely red-faced man was pacing back and forth behind the car, as if hoping the desert plains would offer up some answer. We slowed and pulled up behind him. No way were we leaving a fellow traveler alone on the road, especially knowing how cold it could get even in the summer. And that's another thing about deserts. Most of them get extremely cold at night, you might know, apart from the frozen tundra ones, of course. They're just cold, period. And so, the road we were traveling wasn't entirely void of other travelers, but it wasn't exactly bustling with traffic either. Most of the other drivers seemed to be vacationers or road trippers like us. It wasn't exactly a route that you took to and from work, which in retrospect could have been a red flag, and you'll see why. When we pulled up on the verge behind Angry Breakdown Man, you could almost see the relief fill his body. We all climbed out of the car, but Rich did the talking. He had a bit of a gift of gab. It turns out that the Angry Breakdown Man was named Cliff, and he'd been traveling home from work when something just sort of exploded under his hood. Now, he knew nothing about cars, so he just had to stand there and watch as thick black smoke billowed out from under the hood of his red Ford. Rich did know about cars, and he knew enough to try and pop the hood would be a bad idea right now. Whatever was going on, it looked like it might actually catch fire any minute, and he suggested that Cliff climb in with us, and we'd ride the 3 to 4 hour trip to the motel that we booked, and he could sort his own stuff out from there. Now Rich, ever the kind guy he is, told Cliff not to worry about costs and things for the time being. Kay climbed into the back of the Camry and I moved to sit next to her, in the middle of course, and before I had a chance, Cliff practically dived in my way and scrambled next to Kay. Kay shot me a look that suggested that she wasn't entirely comfortable about this, but what could we say? And let me tell you a little something about this Cliff. He was dressed in what seemed like business attire, but he ditched his suit jacket and tie back of the car. He hadn't bothered to retrieve these, and I could see a dusty suit jacket abandoned on the floor. I guess it wasn't a tailored fit, or maybe work paid for his clothes, I don't know, I'm not an office worker. Now, he was also a fella who was on the larger side. It was impossible for myself and Kay to sit in the back of that Camry next to him without being touched by his sweaty body. And boy, did he sweat. The damp patches under his arms were more like waterfalls than puddles, and even in Rich's air-conditioned, wonderful car that he had, Cliff didn't seem to be cooling down at all. Sweat was just pouring down his face, and I wouldn't normally be this mean about someone's appearance, but I think it's justified here, and I'm sure you'll soon see why. Things were a little awkward at first. Cliff decided to talk about himself relentlessly even when we stopped asking, and the stories he told were similar but weirdly conflicting. One moment he was a salesman who worked out of an office in Salt Lake City. The next he was a traveling salesman, hence why he'd been on that stretch of road. Now he hinted that he was part of the LDS Church, a Mormon you might know them as, but seemed to know nothing about the faith. He claimed that he had a wife and referred to them as being together, but later said that they were separated. One story he did consistently stick to, though, was that he wasn't allowed to see his kids. He reassured us that this was because of his B-word of a mother-in-law and nothing he'd ever done wrong, but, you know, where there's smoke, pouring out of the hood of a red car no less, then there's fire. Now, it's a shame this was in 2002 because he might as well have just claimed it was because, quote, they don't understand the things I say on Twitter. Now, I think by this point, Rich and Andy had tuned him out, leaving Kay and I to listen to Cliff's blabbering and blubbering. Now, the real problematic moment came when his chubby hand rested, by accident, on Kay's bare thigh. She visibly reacted with a hell no, and Cliff acted horrified. He apologized, insisting that he hadn't been thinking, and that he meant nothing by it. I tried to diffuse the situation by pointing out some natural beauty through the right window, and this allowed Kay a private moment to wipe Cliff's sweat from her skin without looking too rude, not that he deserved it. Now, the next weird thing was Cliff blurting out that he believed you just entered an endless abyss of nothing when you die. We hadn't even been discussing a remotely similar topic. He just sort of said it. I'm pretty sure that's not at all what Mormons believe, for one thing. But it was just such a dark, bleak thing to hear as the sun was vanishing over the horizon and the night was kicking in. I checked my watch, still an hour until we reached the rest stop. Cliff fell silent for a moment, then just said it again. An abyss. Yeah, that's what happens. That's what I think. Kay, in perhaps one of her funniest moments, suggested that we play I Spy to distract from Cliff's misery. Everyone else groaned except for Cliff, who just blurted out, "She's back there, you know? Back where I came from?" I asked him what he meant, and with this sudden burst of shocking venom, he said that he was talking about his ex-wife. I wondered if he meant that she was back in the nearest town or city, and that's where she lived with the kids. No. "I left her in the trunk," he said, or something along those lines. Andy, suddenly paying attention, asked the important question. Was she alive?" According to Cliff, she was not. Her decomposing body was in the trunk of his Ford, and had been so for some days. "I did it," he added. Well, holy hot salt, Batman. What were we to do? This guy had just outright claimed that his dead wife, who he had murdered, was sitting in a car we were driving him far away from. On one hand, we could just keep driving and get him to the rest stop before calling the cops. In the early 2000s, our brick Nokias most definitely didn't get reception out in the salt flats, and for all I know, it still is a cell phone dead zone out there. On the other hand, for all we knew, Cliff had a knife or a gun and a surprising propensity for in-vehicle violence. And the longer we drove with him, the more at risk we were. Kay, the genius, had already been working on a plan. Then she says, "Hey Greg, I forgot to show you this pamphlet for the world's biggest aubergine. Check it out." And then she reached past Cliff and handed me this pamphlet. Now I was confused at first until I looked through. Somehow she managed to scribble a few words inside. "Gonna ask to stop to pee. Kick him out." I replied telling Kay that the huge aubergine looked like a great time and we should visit, and that was her cue. She asked Rich to pull over so she could quickly take a pee in the salt desert, and Rich obliged. Kay climbed out of the car, clearly trying to keep calm, and I saw her step to the side. And then, in an act of heroic strength, I genuinely don't think I would have managed if I hadn't been trying to get into Kay's pants, I both shoved and kicked Cliff out of the open door. It somehow went perfectly. He went sprawling face first onto the asphalt, and Kay gave him a kick for good measure and dived back into the car and screamed at Rich to drive. He was peeling away before Kay even got the door closed. Kay and I looked out the back windshield while Rich and Andy checked the rearview mirrors, and what we saw chilled us to the bone. Cliff was spinning around, howling towards the sky, tearing his shirt off, and as he did so, we could see the old healed scars of something that looked like a pentagram on his back. We hightailed it to the rest stop, breaking the speed limit almost in the hopes that we'd get pulled over by cops so we could tell the story. No such luck, but we did call them as soon as we got to the all-night diner attached to the motel. We breathlessly recounted our story to the night waitress, who seemed to regard it with an almost bored acceptance, claiming that yeah, weird things happen around here sometimes. And the cops showed up a couple of hours later, which I guess you can't blame them for given the remote location. And they went looking for Cliff and told us to stay at the motel for a few nights until they got back in touch. and there was no sign of Cliff. They did find his Ford, which had been apparently deliberately torched. There was no murdered ex-wife in the trunk. Whether he went back and retrieved her, or he lied, or something else entirely, I have no idea. There were no reports of a missing person, especially anyone married to a guy called Cliff, and his existence was just some mystery. The cops theorized that the pentagram or whatever we saw carved into his flesh was some kind of leftover from the handful of true stories of satanic panic from the 80s. Some kids really did suffer from abuse masked by the satanic panic furor. Very few people are aware of that fact. Not all of it was actually made up. And so Cliff could have been anyone. He could have been a mentally ill victim of an abusive upbringing. He could have been a member of a 2000-style Manson family. He could have been a wife killer. But one thing he couldn't have been is a passenger on our road trip for any longer than he was, and I have no regrets about kicking that terrifying man to the curb, literally. But as one final sting in the tail, which I'm sure you've guessed, yes, Kay and I never got together. I wasn't her type, I assume anyways, and I had the guts to tackle a potential wife killer, but I still never got the courage to tell Kay how I felt about her. Oh well, if Cliff's marriage was true and any indication of married life, then maybe I'm better off staying as a single, eligible bachelor. I've got a very short but very creepy story for you, as when I was a little kid, I was obsessed with road trips. Every chance I'd get, I'd beg my mom or dad to take me for a drive. I particularly liked driving at night, and there was just something comforting about it, and still is. At first, Mom and Dad both seemed excited to acquiesce to my request, as they say in the Pirates of the Caribbean. It was like a family bonding exercise, but then it became just Mom or just Dad, and they'd both say no. Eventually, my parents split up. Now, I was only about 4 or 5 at the time, so I didn't really understand what was going on. But one night, there was a tapping on my window. Someone was throwing stones. I looked out, and Dad was down in the yard. He whispered me to be quiet and told me to sneak downstairs. Now, I didn't even need to change out of my pajamas, I thought. He had clothes ready for me and a warm coat. And it was time for a night drive, I thought. A big road trip to somewhere that I'd always wanted to go. Death Valley. And so we began the trip. From what I can remember, we kept to some back roads and stayed in the skeeviest motels. But I was with my dad, who I hadn't seen in months, and I was on a road trip, driving at night. It was my favorite. Now, eventually we were driving through the desert. It was wonderful, everything I dreamed of. Our headlights lit up the cacti and cow skulls and broken signs that we saw, and I imagined that I was some cowgirl in the Wild West. Dad called me his little cowgirl angel when I told him this, and then we pulled off the road and onto the sand. I wasn't sure where we were driving, but it was bumpy and I just didn't like it. Dad told me not to worry, that cowgirls didn't cry and that we were almost there. There was an empty clearing. Dad stopped the car and told me to wait in the passenger seat. He climbed out and went around to the trunk. Now, he spent some time there, and when he came back, he motioned for me to crank down my window. Now, when I did, he fed a little green hose pipe through and started tickling me with it. Now, this made me laugh a lot. He told me that we'd get to spend more time together, as much as we wanted, and what a perfect place to do it. Again, I didn't understand what he meant until many years later. Suddenly, there were sirens, and shouting, and yells that guns had been drawn. That hose pipe disappeared from the window, and the rest is just some insane blur. I was now in an ambulance, then I was in a hospital, and then Mom and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles kept coming to visit. Mom was crying a lot. I didn't see Dad, and I kept asking about him, and nobody would say anything. I asked if we were going back to Death Valley and that I wanted to see the desert again. Mom said, maybe one day, but not yet. Now, years later, I found out the truth. Mom had full custody of me, and Dad wasn't allowed to see me at all. I still don't know why, and I'm not sure I really want to know. But he kidnapped me and took me out into the desert, and I'm sure you can imagine what would have come next given that hose pipe. Thankfully, Mom had noticed I was gone and called the cops. They put out some APB and on Dad's car, and the rest is history. Thankfully, I'm fine now. A little bit of therapy and a few night terrors is a small price to pay for surviving, and I'm just glad that Death Valley was a misnomer in this case, and I was able to continue living my life rather than ending up as one of the many bodies buried in that desert sand. Back in the late 90s, me and my buddy went exploring regularly in northern Greenland. We've always been the type to do the opposite of everyone else. Plan to do a tourist trek to a regular area? Not us. We're doing a desert made of snow and ice. It's a pretty popular area to visit for icy desert enthusiasts, but I don't claim to be some ice desert connoisseur. We just prefer the cold, and trust me, Greenland's one of the coldest places on Earth to visit. We're both trained guides for the area, and these days we take tourist expeditions out to plenty of safe spots. Back then, to learn the ropes and learn the limits of our body, though, we'd go on duo expeditions together. At first, we were a bit reckless and soon learned that you cannot treat nature without the respect it's due. Otherwise, you'd end up as one of the many thousands of corpses who have never found proper burials in frozen tundras or icy mountains. We specialize in exploring northern Greenland because it's one of the coldest places on Earth. There's almost no rainfall there, pretty much all the rain falls as snow, and the weather conditions can be insane, and I would place a bet that we've had to cancel more expeditions than we've actually been on due to unsafe weather. This particular story takes place in the late 90s when we were both in our mid-20s. My buddy and I, I'll just call him Arnie, set off with a route in mind solely for the sake of taking it. No end goal, no real point. It just seemed like a good route to take there and back again, with some beautiful vistas for Arnie to capture on his camera, specifically designed for sub-zero conditions. We hiked for a few days, setting up the warmest and coziest tent we could possibly carry between the two of us. And like I said, Greenland's a pretty popular destination for reckless weirdos like us, so we passed a few other explorers on the way. One guy was dog sledding and even offered us a ride because we looked like we were struggling. Naturally, we turned him down. We explained that we had a couple snowmobiles tucked away safely some distance back, and we were using those to get around. On the fourth day, we left our snowmobiles at camp and went for a hike. To our surprise, we found a small cliff which hadn't been on any of the satellite photography. Now remember that even back in the late 90s, mapping parts of the world wasn't as advanced as it is now. It was way before Google Earth, and many areas of the off-beaten track would look like a blur in the footage that we were able to acquire. Now what was more surprising was discovering that the small mountain had a fairly obvious cave opening to it. Of course, we were going inside. It was still morning, so we had plenty of time. Ice caverns don't tend to be particularly dark, especially when they have a large opening like this one did, because the light refracts off the ice and keeps the place somewhat lit up. We brought some glow sticks and a flashlight each, but at first we didn't need them. What we saw caused both of our jaws to drop almost to the floor. There were carvings on the wall, similar to ancient cave paintings and various other archaeological finds we'd read up about during our degrees. These seemed to depict some strange things, though. There were rudimentary figures worshipping a large, bearded man on a throne who seemed to be twice their size. In another mural, the same figures were fighting a beast with spears. It seemed to be some kind of mammoth with tentacles, almost like a Lovecraftian creature, and certainly nothing ever recorded in the history books. There were a couple more of these murals showing the small men fighting, and in some cases being decimated by chthonic creatures. And then the final mural was the oddest. It depicted the large bearded man who'd been sitting on the throne, but he was holding some kind of device, a very futuristic looking device. "Is that a Game Boy?" my buddy asked. Now it certainly looked like one. Almost immediately, though, our attention was caught by a dais on the far wall with an almost perfectly intact polar bear cub skeleton displayed there. However, instead of the normal canines one would expect to see in a young polar bear, the creature instead had walrus-like tusks. Again, this was not a creature that had been recorded in any sort of zoology book. Arnie and I began to get excited, very excited. It was possible that we'd stumbled upon the find of the decade, and this would change everything that we knew about ancient civilization. This would make us rich, and we would go down in history as two of the most important scientists the world had ever known. If only it hadn't been for that goddamn Game Boy in the final carving. "You like my art, huh?" The voice called out from the back of the cave in a different room. I recognized the accent immediately as Norwegian, and a man came staggering into the room, clutching an ancient-looking bottle of what I'm sure was some home-brewed moonshine of sorts. "Like my home, do you? Just walk in, do you?" And we began to profusely apologize. It didn't quite dawn on me then, but what we found was a very unconventional Germanic artist. None of these cave carvings were ancient secrets of mankind. None of those monsters were unknown beasts. They were this drunken Norwegian bestial's OCs, really, and there was a carving of him being worshipped by his minions. And then, for some reason, he'd carved a picture of himself playing a Game Boy, probably. What the horrible polar bear skeleton was, I have no idea. I guess he'd moved on to sculpture. We profusely apologized and began to slowly back away from the door. I say slowly because we noticed that in his other hand, the Norwegian was clutching what looked like one of those pistols from World War II. You know, the ones the Germans wielded, the Walther. "Maybe one of you will stay here," he said, very clearly looking at Arnie. According to the Norwegian artist, it got very lonely out in the caves, making his art. Maybe my friend Arnie would be a perfect companion for him, someone to warm his bed at night and warm his body, too. No, I'm not going to speak for Arnie, but I didn't think it sounded like an appealing prospect for him, and I wasn't ready to leave my friend to the mercy of a clearly drunk, clearly insane Norwegian. When the man threw his empty bottle against the wall, we both jumped in fear, and this Norwegian roared with laughter. His pistol was now trained on both of us. The Norwegian grunted that actually he was bored of us, and he was sure that he could find a much better companion. As his English grew more and more broken, he told us that we had 10 seconds to run before he ended us there and then and turned us into his latest art pieces. Me and Arnie had never ran so fast out of anywhere, ever. I have no idea if the Norwegian was even following us. I didn't even care. We did not stop running for 2 hours until we reached the camp and the snowmobiles, and by then we could at least see that he wasn't following us. We packed up camp and hightailed it out of there, riding those snowmobiles for 2 days without a break, and we only stopped to refuel. The adrenaline, the cold, and some substances we should not have had kept us awake. We got back to the nearest town and immediately reported everything to local law enforcement, but you know what they said? "Oh yeah, that's Lars. He can get a bit like that, he's a real character, but he's harmless though." They wouldn't even go out to speak to him. Now, I still love Greenland. We live there and operate as tour guides for tourists who want to see the nice and safe parts of the country. But trust me, we don't take them anywhere near Lars's cave. And it was hard to tell how old he was. He could have been 80 or he could have been 28. In my opinion, he's still out there, carving his little weird drawings, and I guess it is a unique art in a way. The main thing I wondered, though, was whether he's upgraded from the Game Boy he carved himself playing, or if he's got a Nintendo Switch now. So I'm a true blue Aussie. I'm not ashamed to throw another shrimp on the Barbie. I have a beloved Ute, and Great Northern Super Crisp is my favorite beer. Contrary to what people believe, none of us like Foster's. Tastes like piss. It's made here, but it isn't drunk here. Super Crisp is where it's at. I love this country, I really do, but have you seen how incredibly massive it is? There's a ranch here that is literally bigger than Texas. And I did a bit of work there once. You have to travel by helicopter just to get to one part of the ranch from another. It's madness. And so I have this mate, an English fella, who moved to Oz when we were both young. His name is Malcolm, and Malcolm is as solid as they come. Now, he's a middle child, but he's gotten so sick of the jokes in early secondary school that he insisted on being called Malk, not Malcolm. And at first people ignored him. But then he had this huge growth spurt and became the hardest guy in our year, and nobody's messed with him then. Imagine a bunch of Aussie blokes being schooled by an English ponce named Malcolm. Christ, he better not listen to the story. He'll kick my butt 6 ways from Sunday if he hears me call him a ponce. I'm just a little wiry dude. I'm pretty sure I'd be a Wasteman Bogan if it wasn't for Malk. He's my rock. And speaking of rocks, this is where the story is heading. When we finished school, we'd always planned on taking a year or 2 or 3 to explore our wonderful country before we went back into education. And one of the places we'd both always longed to visit was Uluru, the Ayers Rock to you foreigners. It's a bloody majestic place it is. Photos don't do it justice, they really don't. In fact, it's actually easy to see photos of Uluru in books and get mixed up with totally different smaller rocks. That is, if you're a dummy with no sense of direction and no Malk to guide you on the right path. But here's the bummer. Malk and I planned this epic adventure all throughout multiple years of school. We were both a fifth of the way into this planned expedition. We were going to play it by ear, but the final year was meant to just be, let's head wherever. And so we rented a nice hotel for our trip to Uluru. No, I'm just kidding. We actually stayed in the grodiest hostel that you can imagine, and I'm pretty sure that's how Malk got sick as a frickin' wild dog. Now, I won't go into details, but it was coming out both ends, if you know what I mean. And naturally, I was going to delay the trip to Uluru or cancel it altogether, but Malk then responds, "No, mate, you gotta go. It's bad luck if we change the plans. Go there for me, get some bonzer photos, and if it really is as epic as they say, then we'll do a return visit on our way back cross-country." Well, I didn't need much persuading. I loaded up the ute with supplies tossed in the spare single-man pop-up tent that we'd been carting around, and headed off on an adventure as Malcolm headed off for yet another trip to some grody bathroom. Poor guy. But in retrospect, the stomach bug probably did him one hell of a favor. So imagine a montage of me driving to Uluru in my ute, confident that I don't need a map or GPS because I guess I've memorized the route a million times, and imagine me reaching Uluru and feeling a little underwhelmed because it's a lot smaller than I was led to believe, and a lot less vibrant. It was just kind of a big rock. I don't know what I was expecting, but in the moment I thought, I'm here now. I parked a bit of a distance away. I didn't want to disturb the tranquility with my loud-ass car, and then headed to Uluru on foot. Or at least I thought I did. Eventually I decided to check my map and my compass and realized that I somehow managed to go ass over tit and ended up in completely the wrong place. This wasn't Uluru, not at all. It really was just some underwhelming rock, and how I managed this I'll never know. Like I said, I'd be a waster bogan if it wasn't for Malcolm's influence in my life. My useless sense of direction meant that it took me a solid 3 hours to walk to the rock, which I've nicknamed Yoo-Hoo, and I kind of just wandered around the place, taking a few photos, imagining how Malk was going to rip the absolute feces out of me when I told him about this. But just then I heard this voice. Now, if I thought that I was a true-blooded Australian, this guy put me to shame. He was like every rough Australian survivalist stereotype thrown into one, having smoked 40 cigarettes a day to boot. And guess what? He was a survivalist. He wore a duster and one of those hats with the corks, which I genuinely thought only existed for tourists. But no, he told me later that they were an Aussie staple. Now, we got to chatting and I explained that I was looking for and initially thought that I'd found Uluru, and he got my back up a bit when he called me a tourist, but this guy didn't seem like the kind of fella that you wanted to mess with, so I just laughed it off. I mean, to be fair, I had been an idiot. I told him where I'd parked the ute, and he just shook his head. Apparently, I'd gotten all turned around there too, and there was no way that I was getting back to the ute before dark. I'd left the tent and all my camping gear in that vehicle, thinking that there was no way that I was going to stay at this random rock overnight. And this survivalist told me that his name was Donegan, but his friends just call him Donnie. Now, I wasn't sure if this meant that I was allowed to call him Donnie or not, so I just called him Donegan, and he didn't correct me. He was a friendly fella. Now anyways, Donegan told me that there was no way that I'd get back to the ute before it got dark and freezing, and I'd almost definitely die and blah blah blah, but thankfully, he had a home not far from here. I was surprised because I hadn't seen any houses or shacks or anything like that. Now Donegan led me around the side of the rock and then climbed up a little, and he ushered me to follow him. And I was kind of amazed that by climbing up, you were able to see an opening in the rock face which led into a cave. We squeezed through, and I have to admit that I was impressed at the home Donegan had made for himself. He had a whole wall of shelves filled with battered paperback books, some fiction, some philosophy, all too intelligent looking for me, and he had another shelf filled with what seemed to be journals. One opening in the cave led to what appeared to be a bathroom with a seemingly full water tank for washing. Now the other door had been sort of curtained off, and Donegan, in a surprisingly polite voice, asked me not to go in there because that was the kitchen, and a man's kitchen is his palace. I wasn't entirely sure that this was the saying, but whatever. Now the sun was beginning to set now, and Donegan lit the fire pit in the center of his cave. Thankfully, the entrance was wide enough to let some of the smoke out, and he also bored a chimney through the rock so we didn't suffocate on whatever fumes we might have been cooking with. Donegan told me to make myself at home and particularly encouraged me to browse his shelves while he headed into the curtained-off kitchen to prepare our raw meal. He did kindly ask me not to read his journals, and again, he was weirdly polite about this. Now, I was starting to get the impression that the more polite Donegan's rule requests were, the more he would kick me in the wiener if I broke them. But reading another man's journal has never been something I've had a desire to do, not even the time Malcolm left his gay little therapy journal lying on the bed when I knew he had a crush on the girl I was seeing. Now anyways, I browsed through Donegan's books. I'd love to tell you the titles, but I can't remember them and I can't be bothered. I do remember he had a bunch of well-thumbed-through true crime books, some cookbooks, and one by that philosopher Nietzsche. Now the next minute, Donegan's brushing through the curtain with two absolutely mouth-watering looking slabs of meat. Now I was so hungry I could have eaten them raw there and then. He tossed an onion at me and told me to get chopping, pointing to a block by the fire. I did my best not to cry as I hacked up the onion. I've always been an onion crier, and I know Donegan gave me the onion just to make me weep. Now, all was forgiven once he started frying up the steaks. They both looked like 12-ounce mothers and the leanest meats I've ever seen. I tossed the chopped onions in the pan when Donegan commanded, and after a few minutes, he served up 2 steaks, medium rare. I expected him to be a rare steak or blue steak type man, but he said this meat and these onions shone the most at medium rare. He briefly heated up a jar of sauce, which was divine, and we sat in silence as I ate maybe the greatest dinner I've ever been served. "How was that as a last meal?" Donegan asked. His face was stony and serious, and I asked him to repeat what he'd said. I said, "How would that be as a last meal?" he said. But the smirk on his face let me know he knew exactly what he said originally. I told him it would be pretty much ideal as a last meal. Donegan laughed and said, thankfully it would be. I'd enjoyed plenty of great cuisine on my grand trip, and then, out of the blue, he asked if I'd been to the Blanglo State Forest. I said I hadn't, but it was on our bucket list. Donegan looked at me seriously and warned me to be careful, because the backpacker killer was still roaming that forest, looking for backpackers to kill. I pointed out that Ivan Milat had been arrested years ago, and funnily enough, he died a couple of years after this. Donegan just nodded thoughtfully but said nothing. Something told me that he either didn't believe Ivan Milat was the backpacker killer, he never officially confessed to anyone but his mother, or Donegan was trying to spook me by hinting that he was the killer. And then he asked me if I'd enjoyed the human meat I'd just consumed. By that point, I was getting wise to old Donnie's tricks. He wanted a reaction, so I gave him one. I jumped up in shock, shouting in horror, asking if he'd really fed me human meat. Donegan stared at me for what seemed like forever and then laughed. Without a word, he walked into the kitchen and came back out, hefting a cow carcass over his shoulder with cuts removed. "This was your dinner, pal," he said, and then dropped the carcass in one corner. "Now, time to sleep." And I had no choice, I figured. I lay on the guest mattress that Donegan offered me and tried to drift off, and somehow, briefly, I did. I don't know what woke me, but I woke with the knowledge that I absolutely had to leave immediately. The fire was still smoldering, and I could see that Donegan was not in his bed. It looked untouched. The cow carcass was also missing, and since I hadn't really brought any belongings with me to this Yoo-Hoo Rock, I figured that I could just duck out under cover of night. I'd rather freeze to death than face whatever weirdness Donegan had in store for me next, and as soon as he'd mentioned Ivan Milat, my hackles had already been raised. And so I snuck out of the cave and slid down the side. I made it quite some distance, and I thought that I had a good idea of the direction of the ute, and then I was stopped in my stride. Donegan stood there in the middle of the desert surrounded by what I can only assume dogs or dingoes. They'd clearly feasted on the remains of the cow carcass because bones lay picked clean on the ground. Donegan looked at me, and as one, so did all the dingoes, their eyes glowing in the moonlight reflected in their pupils, and I swear, Donegan's eyes glowed like those dingoes in that moment. The dingoes started growling, and I saw their own hackles rise. Donegan commanded them to sit, and all 5 that I could see, without fail, obeyed him. Dingoes. Wild animals. And if you don't know, dingoes aren't like dogs. They're majestic and beautiful creatures, but you really cannot tame them unless you've raised them since birth. "They obey my every word," Donegan said. "I could sick them on you if I wanted. They wouldn't leave me a scrap." I asked him to please not do that, and Donegan let out a laugh. "What do you think, boys?" And then he started asking me if I knew that dingoes once ate a baby, and I said of course, it was a very famous case, even if I wasn't born at the time. He told me that apparently fully grown humans are tastier to dingoes than babies, and I didn't want to know how he knew this, so I didn't ask. And then he told me that dingoes can outrun a man 3 times as fast. Again, I wasn't sure if this was true, so I kind of begged him not to force me to find out. Again, Donegan asked the dingoes if they thought that they should feed on me, and at this point I'm not ashamed to say that I pissed my own pants and pleaded with him not to hurt me, and to let me live. Donegan looked at me with disgust and said that I'd soiled myself now, and I was lucky because there was no way he was letting his beloved dingoes eat my piss-covered flesh. Instead, he walked away, commanding his beasts to heel, and I didn't know if I could trust him, but I took a gamble. And you know what? It turns out the ute was parked just behind the small rock Donegan had been standing near, and he'd left me a parting gift. The head of the cow we'd eaten just earlier and that the dingoes had feasted on was sitting on the windshield. I had to wash the blood off, leaving me even more paranoid that the other shoe was about to drop and I was about to be attacked. But thankfully no. Instead, I finally got the windscreen clean enough that I could see through and gunned the ute. I drove away, and I swear after 10 minutes of driving in the rearview mirror I could see a pack of dingoes running behind my car, their eyes shining in the darkness. When I reached our hostel, Malk had stopped vacating his bowels and his stomach was feeling a lot better, but when I told him the tale of Donegan and his dingoes, his face went whiter than I'd seen it when he was sick. He told me, and swears on his life that he wasn't winding me up, that he'd read about a man who was cursed to walk the central desert communing with the wildlife, and if you accepted his invitation to dine with him, he only let you leave if he deemed you worthy. I explained that he only let me leave because I pissed myself, and this left Malk a little less sure that I'd had a supernatural encounter. Needless to say, I went to the cops the next day, and they reassured me that I very much had not encountered some supernatural spirit. Based on my description, what I'd encountered instead was a wanted fugitive who robbed a number of post offices at gunpoint in Alice Springs and the surrounding area. They'd been searching for him for a few years and had no idea that he'd been hiding out in a cave in what I called Yoo-Hoo Rock. We stuck around the area, forking out for a better hotel than what we were currently slumming in, and I'm glad we did. The cops managed to apprehend Donegan, who was indeed the armed robber that they were looking for. There was no sign of his tamed dingoes, and I'm glad of that. They were innocent, and I hope they went off to have exciting cow-hunting lives. But as for Donegan, you may be an a-hole who robs post offices at shotgun point, but you do cook a mean steak. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks and bonus content from members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.